Richard Ashford, for the cold-blooded execution of your family, I sentence you to life in prison.
You can lock me up, I don't care. I silenced the snitch, and I took out the trash. I'm finally free.
On November 16th, Detective Owen Taylor was called to the Ashford estate in Savannah's historic district. 3 bodies had been found inside the mansion, 2 adults and 1 teenager, all dead from gunshot wounds. The only survivor was a 14-year-old boy who sat calmly in the kitchen, waiting for police. He claimed an intruder had broken in during the night and murdered his family. But as Detective Taylor began his investigation, the boy's account started to fall apart. The evidence told a different story, one that would reveal a dark truth hidden behind the estate's wrought iron gates. Before we dive deeper into this shocking case, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you're finding this content valuable, and please share in the comments where you're watching from today. Now let's continue with this story. Taylor had been a homicide detective for 11 years, and he had learned to trust the prickling sensation at the base of his skull that told him when something was wrong. Richard Ashford sat at the granite kitchen island, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the stone surface, his eyes fixed on the phone in front of him, rather than on the officers documenting the scene of his family's destruction. The boy had called 911 at 6:47 that morning, his voice steady and clear as he reported finding his father, mother, and sister dead. Taylor had heard the recording, had noted the absence of panic, the clinical precision with which the teenager had provided the address, and described the scene. Now, watching Richard check his phone for the 4th time in as many minutes, Taylor felt that familiar prickling intensify. "Richard, I need you to put the phone down," Taylor said, his voice gentle but firm. The boy looked up, his blue eyes meeting the detective's gaze with an unsettling directness that seemed wrong for someone who had supposedly just discovered his entire family murdered. Richard's hand hovered over the device, and in that moment it buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a notification that appeared as a string of encrypted characters. The boy's jaw tightened, a micro-expression of irritation flickering across his face before he schooled his features back into what Taylor assumed was meant to be grief. Taylor crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, his hand extended. "I'm going to need that phone, Richard." The words were not a request. Richard's fingers curled around the device, his knuckles whitening, and for a heartbeat, Taylor thought the boy might refuse. Then Richard's expression smoothed into compliance, and he handed over the phone with a shrug that seemed almost theatrical in its indifference. The phone buzzed in Taylor's hand, another encrypted notification rolling across the locked screen. "What app is this?" Taylor asked, turning the device so Richard could see the display. The boy's face went carefully blank, a poker player's expression that Taylor had seen on hardened criminals, but never on a 14-year-old who had just lost his family. Richard's lips parted, closed, parted again as if he were calibrating his response with mathematical precision. "I don't know what that is," Richard said finally, his voice carrying a note of manufactured confusion. "Maybe something my dad installed?" The lie hung in the air between them, palpable and clumsy. Taylor had been questioning suspects since before Richard was born, and he knew the difference between genuine confusion and calculated deception. The phone buzzed a 3rd time in Taylor's hand, and he made a decision that would later prove critical to the entire investigation. "I'm going to hold on to this for now," he said, slipping the device into an evidence bag. Richard's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, his eyes widening and his breath catching in a way that spoke of genuine alarm rather than grief. Taylor caught it, logged it in the mental notebook he kept of behavioral inconsistencies. The crime scene told a story that didn't align with Richard's version of events. Reginald Ashford, 42, lay in his home office, a gunshot wound to the head and the family's registered 9mm pistol on the floor beside his desk chair. Cordelia Ashford, 39, was in the master bedroom, a matching wound and a carefully composed scene suggesting she had been shot while sleeping. Serafina Ashford, 8 years old, was in her bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and homework assignments that would never be completed. The initial assessment suggested a murder-suicide, a father who had killed his wife and daughter before turning the gun on himself. But Taylor's gut told him otherwise, and the phone buzzing with encrypted messages from an app that supposedly didn't exist was just the beginning. Richard claimed he had spent the night at his friend Marcus's house, returning home at dawn to discover the bodies. He claimed he had tried to call his father's phone first, then his mother's, before calling 911. He claimed he had been too shocked to touch anything, to check for pulses, to do anything but report what he had found. Every claim felt rehearsed, delivered with the mechanical precision of a student reciting memorized lines. Taylor's partner, Detective Lisa Chen, emerged from the hallway, her expression grim. "Owen? You need to see the sister's room," she said, her voice low enough that Richard couldn't hear from his position in the kitchen. Taylor followed her down the corridor, past family photographs that showed a picture-perfect family. Reginald with his professional smile, Cordelia with her warm physician's compassion, and the children, Richard and Serafina, posed in front of Savannah landmarks. In Serafina's room, Chen pointed to a detail that made Taylor's blood run cold. The little girl's laptop sat open on her desk, a homework document still displayed on the screen. "Look at the timestamp," Chen said, and Taylor leaned in to read the metadata. The document had been accessed at 11:47 p.m. on November 11th, less than an hour before the medical examiner's preliminary estimate for time of death. Serafina had been working on her homework when something had interrupted her, something that had ended with a bullet. A father committing murder-suicide doesn't usually shoot his daughter while she's doing homework, Taylor said, voicing what they were both thinking. He waits until they're asleep, makes it as peaceful as possible in his mind. Chen nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the same growing certainty that this was not what it appeared to be. They walked back to the kitchen where Richard sat, his posture relaxed, but his gaze tracking their movements with an intensity that felt predatory. "Richard, tell me about your relationship with your sister," Taylor said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from the boy. Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that might have been calculation, or might have been the first real emotion Taylor had seen from him. The boy's fingers returned to their drumming pattern on the granite, a nervous tick that belied his calm exterior. "We were normal siblings," Richard said, his voice flat and uninflected. "Sometimes we fought, sometimes we got along." The answer was textbook, the kind of response a teenager might give to a school counselor asking routine questions. It revealed nothing, committed to nothing, and Taylor had learned long ago that the most revealing thing about an answer was often what it carefully avoided revealing. "What did you fight about?" Taylor pressed, leaning forward slightly. Richard's drumming fingers stilled for a moment, then resumed their rhythm with increased intensity. The boy's gaze drifted to the window, to the view of the garden where he and Serafina had presumably played as children. "Kid stuff?" Richard said with a shrug. "She was annoying sometimes, always tattling about stupid things." The words were casual, but Taylor heard the edge of resentment underneath, a bitterness that seemed disproportionate to normal sibling rivalry. Chen had moved to stand by the doorway, her phone out, as she coordinated with the crime scene technicians, but Taylor knew she was listening to every word. "When was the last time you saw your family alive?" Taylor asked, changing tactics. Richard's eyes snapped back to meet his, and for a moment Taylor saw something in that blue gaze that made his skin crawl. It was the look of someone evaluating a chess opponent, calculating moves and countermoves. "Thursday night, before I went to Marcus's house," Richard said, "around 7 p.m. We had dinner together." The timeline placed Richard away from the house during the murders, assuming his alibi held. Taylor made a mental note to have Chen verify the friend's statement immediately. The phone in the evidence bag on the counter buzzed again, and Richard's eyes flicked toward it with unmistakable longing. "Those notifications," Taylor said, watching the boy's reaction carefully. "They've been coming in pretty regularly. Someone trying to reach you?" Richard's face went carefully neutral again, but not before Taylor caught the flash of panic. "I told you, I don't know what that app is," Richard insisted, but his voice had risen slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "Maybe it's spam or something?" The explanation was laughable, and they both knew it. Encrypted notifications didn't come from spam apps, and the frequency suggested someone on the other end who was growing increasingly concerned about the lack of response. Taylor stood pocketing his notebook. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement," he said. Richard nodded, his expression suggesting this was exactly what he had expected. As Taylor watched the boy stand and gather his jacket, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far darker than a family tragedy. The buzzing phone, the encrypted messages, the cold detachment in a 14-year-old's eyes as he sat in a house with 3 bodies, it all added up to a picture that Taylor was only beginning to see. By the time they reached the station, the phone had buzzed 6 more times, each notification arriving with the insistence of someone who desperately needed a response. Taylor handed the device to the department's digital forensics specialist, Dr. Marcus Chen, with explicit instructions to unlock it and trace those messages. What they would discover in the phone's deleted files would transform this case from a potential murder-suicide into something that would shock even seasoned investigators. A meticulously planned triple homicide orchestrated by a child who had been radicalized by anonymous predators in the darkest corners of the Internet. Dr. Marcus Chen sat in the fluorescent-lit forensics lab on the 3rd floor of Savannah Police Department's headquarters. Richard Ashford's phone connected to a diagnostic machine that hummed quietly as it pulled data from the device's memory. Chen had been doing digital forensics for 8 years, had cracked encrypted phones for drug cartels and white-collar criminals, but something about this case felt different. The phone belonged to a 14-year-old boy whose entire family lay in the morgue. Yet the device's activity pattern suggested someone who had been expecting exactly this outcome. Chen's fingers flew across his keyboard, bypassing security protocols with practiced efficiency, each layer of encryption revealing another fragment of a disturbing digital trail. The first breakthrough came at 2:37 p.m. on November 13th, when Chen managed to access the phone's recently deleted applications folder. Among the standard teenage apps, Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, there was a conspicuous gap in the phone's application registry. Something had been installed on October 28th and deleted on November 12th, the same day as the murders. The deletion had been thorough, or at least Richard had thought so, but the boy didn't understand that modern smartphones maintained shadow copies of application data in multiple redundant systems. Chen pulled up the backup files and felt his stomach drop when he identified what Richard had tried to erase. It was a GPS tracking application called Family Watch, marketed to concerned parents who wanted to monitor their children's locations. The irony was almost painful. Chen dove deeper into the app's cached data and discovered that Reginald Ashford had indeed installed it on his son's phone 6 months earlier, probably after some incident that had triggered parental concern. Richard would have received notifications every time the app logged his location, would have known his father was watching his movements. What Richard apparently didn't know was that Family Watch automatically backed up all location data to a cloud server, and that cloud account was tied to Reginald's email address, not Richard's phone. Chen accessed the cloud backup using credentials he had obtained from Reginald's computer, and the data that populated his screen told a story that obliterated Richard's alibi. The GPS logs showed Richard's phone at the Ashford residence from 10:15 p.m. on November 11th through 6:30 a.m. on November 12th, never moving more than 200 feet from the house's center point. The logs were time-stamped and precise, tracking movement from room to room with enough accuracy that Chen could reconstruct Richard's path through the house during the critical hours. At 11:43 p.m., Richard's phone moved from his bedroom to Serafina's room, remaining there for 4 minutes. At 11:52 p.m., the phone moved to the master bedroom, staying for 6 minutes. At 12:03 a.m., it moved to Reginald's office, remaining there for 11 minutes. After that, the phone returned to Richard's bedroom and stayed there until 6:15 a.m., when it moved to the kitchen and the 911 call was placed. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with the medical examiner's estimated times of death: Serafina between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, Cordelia between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., Reginald between midnight and 12:30 a.m. Chen sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as the implications settled over him. This wasn't a murder-suicide. This was a 14-year-old boy methodically executing his entire family, and the GPS data placed him at each murder scene at the exact moment it occurred. The boy had claimed to be at his friend Marcus's house, but the phone had never left the Ashford estate. Detective Taylor arrived at the lab within 20 minutes of Chen's call, and the forensic specialist walked him through the data with the grim thoroughness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "He was there, Owen," Chen said, pulling up a visual map that showed Richard's phone as a blue dot moving through a floor plan of the Ashford house. Every single murder. The phone places him in Serafina's room right when she was killed, then Cordelia's room, then Reginald's office. The timeline is perfect, too perfect to be coincidence. Taylor studied the map, his jaw tightening as he absorbed what he was seeing. "The friend Marcus, what's his story?" he asked. Chen pulled up his notes from the interview Chen had conducted that morning while Taylor had been at the crime scene. "Marcus Turner, 14, lives about 2 miles from the Ashford estate," Chen read from his screen. "He confirmed that Richard was supposed to come over Thursday night, November 11th. Said Richard texted him around 7:30 p.m., saying his parents changed their minds and wouldn't let him leave the house." Chen highlighted a text message exchange he had recovered from Marcus's phone. Marcus offered to ask his mom to call the Ashfords and advocate for Richard, but Richard told him not to bother, said he'd just stay home and they'd hang out another time. So Richard established an alibi that he knew wouldn't be checked because he told the friend not to involve the parents, Taylor said, piecing it together. He was setting up the appearance of planning to be elsewhere while actually staying home to commit the murders. The premeditation was chilling, the calculation required for a 14-year-old to orchestrate such a deception. Chen nodded and opened another file on his screen. "It gets worse," he said, and Taylor wasn't sure how that was possible. "I found the app he was trying to hide, the one causing those encrypted notifications." Chen pulled up screenshots of a dark web forum interface, the design deliberately obscure and threatening. It's called the Liberation Front, and it's basically a radicalization chamber for teenagers who feel oppressed by parental authority. The forum's message threads read like a manifesto of adolescent rage transformed into ideology. Users with names like Chainbreaker and Emancipator posted elaborate justifications for violence against parents, framing murder as an act of revolutionary self-liberation. Taylor felt sick as he read posts from Richard's account, username FreedomSeeker88, chronicling his growing radicalization over the 72 hours following his grounding. On November 9th, Richard had posted about his father discovering he had stolen the credit card to purchase $200 in Fortnite V-Bucks. The post dripped with entitlement and rage. "Grounded for 2 weeks because I used his money, like he even earned it, sitting in his office moving numbers around. Says I have to pay him back from my allowance. That'll take months. Meanwhile, my squad is leveling up without me. This is tyranny." The responses had been immediate and enthusiastic, other users validating his anger and escalating it into something darker. A user identified only as Cypher had been particularly active in Richard's thread, posting responses that Taylor recognized as grooming. "Your parents don't own you," Cypher had written. "You're a sovereign individual. They use financial control to maintain their power over you. True freedom requires the complete severance of oppressive bonds." The language was sophisticated, manipulative, designed to make a grounded teenager feel like a political prisoner rather than a child facing consequences. By November 10th, Richard's posts had shifted from complaining to openly fantasizing about violence. "What if they just weren't here anymore?" he had written. "What would actually happen? I'm 14, they can't execute me. Juvie until I'm 21, then I'm free with access to all the money they've been hoarding. 7 years for permanent freedom." Cypher had responded within minutes. "Strategic thinking. You understand the risk-reward calculation. That's more rational than most adults." Chen pulled up the most disturbing exchange, dated November 11th at 9:47 p.m., less than 2 hours before Serafina's murder. Richard had posted, "My sister saw my screen. She knows I'm on here. Threatened to tell parents tomorrow. My window is closing." Cypher's response had been immediate and explicit. "Witnesses cannot be tolerated. The sister becomes part of the operation. I'll send you the technical manual." Taylor felt his hands curl into fists as he read Cypher's technical manual, a step-by-step guide to committing family annihilation that read like a grotesque parody of an instruction manual. It specified the order of kills, starting with the most vulnerable witness and ending with the physically strongest family member. It detailed how to stage the scene to suggest murder-suicide. It even included advice on emotional presentation. Display shock and grief immediately. Tears are not necessary. Many people freeze in trauma. Confusion is more believable than sorrow in the first hours. "Who is Cypher?" Taylor demanded, and Chen's expression told him the answer before the specialist spoke. "Unknown," Chen said. "The forum runs on an encrypted network, routes through multiple proxy servers across different countries. Every user is anonymous. Cypher's account was created 3 years ago and has been active in radicalizing at least 14 other teenagers that I can identify from the posting history. This person is sophisticated, knows exactly how to manipulate adolescent psychology." Taylor stood and paced the small lab, trying to process what he was learning. So Richard is radicalized online, receives explicit instructions on how to kill his family, and follows them to the letter. The GPS proves he was there for every murder, contradicting his alibi completely. Chen nodded, and Taylor continued, "We can arrest him today. We have enough for charges." "There's one more thing," Chen said, pulling up yet another file. "I recovered Richard's search history from the past week. He was researching juvenile sentencing laws, specifically Roper v. Simmons." Taylor knew the case, a 2005 Supreme Court decision that had abolished the death penalty for offenders under 18. He knew exactly what his maximum punishment would be. He calculated that life without parole was an acceptable price for financial freedom and internet notoriety. The calculated nature of the crime was staggering. This wasn't a moment of rage or a psychotic break. This was a teenager who had spent 72 hours being groomed by an online predator, who had researched the legal consequences, who had planned each step with chilling precision. Richard had murdered his 8-year-old sister not in panic, but in cold calculation, eliminating a witness who threatened his timeline. Taylor called prosecutor Sophia Robinson from Chen's lab, and within 3 hours they had arrest warrants and a strategy. They would charge Richard as an adult with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and they would use the GPS data and the forum communications to prove premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Robinson listened to Chen's presentation with the grim focus of someone calculating a path through a minefield, and when she spoke, Her voice was steel. "We're going to need every piece of data from that phone," Robinson said. "The GPS logs, the forum communications, the search history, all of it. And I want a comprehensive analysis of Cypher's posting history. If we can't catch this predator, we can at least expose the pattern of grooming." Chen nodded, already compiling the files. Taylor felt a cold satisfaction settling in his chest, the certainty that they had the evidence to ensure Richard would never walk free. At 7:15 p.m. on November 13th, Taylor and 4 officers arrived at the temporary housing where Richard had been placed with his aunt. The boy answered the door with that same unsettling calm, as if he had been expecting them. When Taylor read him his rights and informed him he was under arrest for the murders of Reginald Cordelia and Serafina Ashford, Richard's expression didn't change. He simply held out his wrists for the handcuffs, a 14-year-old boy who had murdered his family and felt nothing. As they drove to the station, Taylor watched Richard in the rearview mirror. The boy stared out the window at Savannah's historic streets, his face reflecting the passing streetlights. "You know we found the GPS data," Taylor said, breaking protocol but unable to contain himself. Richard's eyes met his in the mirror, and for the first time Taylor saw a flicker of genuine emotion. Not fear or remorse, but irritation, the frustration of a player who had miscalculated a move. "I deleted that app," Richard said, and Taylor heard the petulance of a child caught cheating on a test. "I made sure." The confession was casual, delivered without apparent awareness that he had just admitted to knowing the app existed and having a reason to delete it. Taylor felt a grim vindication, knowing that every word Richard spoke was digging his grave deeper. At the station they processed Richard through booking, and Chen delivered a preliminary forensics report that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. The GPS data was irrefutable, a digital fingerprint that placed Richard at each murder scene with timestamp precision. The forum communication showed premeditation and grooming. The search history showed calculated research into sentencing laws. Together, the evidence painted a portrait of a crime that was as premeditated as it was horrifying. Taylor sat in his office long after Richard had been transferred to the juvenile detention center, reading through Cypher's posting history with a growing sense of rage. This predator had radicalized teenagers across the country, turning adolescent grievances into violent fantasies and then into actionable plans. Richard was just the first to act on Cypher's instructions that they had discovered, but Chen had found evidence of other teenagers in similar stages of radicalization. They needed to find Cypher before another family was destroyed. The digital evidence had transformed the case from a tragic murder-suicide into a prosecution that would test the limits of how society handles juvenile killers. Richard Ashford had killed his family with the cold calculation of an adult, but the legal protections of a child, and the question of how to reconcile those contradictions would dominate the trial to come. For now, Taylor had the satisfaction of knowing that Richard would face justice, that the GPS data had exposed his lies, and the forum communications had revealed his motive. The phone Richard had tried so desperately to hide had become the instrument of his own conviction. The Liberation Front server architecture was a masterpiece of digital obfuscation, routing through 7 different countries and employing encryption protocols that made NSA-level security look simplistic. FBI Cyber Crimes Division agent Sarah Mitchell stood in Savannah PD's conference room on November 15th, her laptop connected to a projector displaying the forum's labyrinthine structure. Detective Taylor sat across from her, Prosecutor Robinson to his right, while Dr. Marcus Chen occupied his usual position by the evidence wall, which was now covered with printouts of forum posts and network diagrams. Mitchell had flown in from Quantico 4 hours after receiving Chen's data package, and her expression communicated the grave seriousness of what they were dealing with. Cypher is not just one predator, Mitchell began, her laser pointer highlighting clusters of posts across a timeline spanning 3 years. We're looking at a sophisticated operation, possibly multiple individuals using a single identity, targeting adolescents in vulnerable psychological states. The posting patterns show activity across multiple time zones simultaneously, which suggests either a team or someone using automated responses to initial contacts. She clicked to a new slide showing linguistic analysis of Cypher's communications. However, the direct message exchanges with Richard show consistent syntax, vocabulary, and psychological manipulation techniques that suggest one primary operator. Taylor leaned forward, studying the analysis. So Cypher finds these kids, validates their anger. Then what? Mitchell's expression darkened as she pulled up a flowchart that showed Cypher's grooming methodology with clinical precision. Stage 1 is validation, Mitchell explained, highlighting the first tier of the chart. Cypher finds posts from teenagers expressing frustration with parental authority, normal adolescent complaints. The initial responses are sympathetic, non-threatening. Your parents don't understand you. You're smarter than they realize. You deserve autonomy. This builds trust and creates a feeling of being seen. She advanced to the next slide, showing excerpts from Richard's early exchanges with Cypher. Stage 2 is ideological escalation. Cypher introduces political and philosophical frameworks that reframe parental authority as oppression. In Richard's case, Cypher used libertarian rhetoric about individual sovereignty and property rights. Your parents claim to love you, but love doesn't involve controlling your finances, monitoring your movements, restricting your freedom. That's not parenting, that's tyranny. The language is sophisticated enough to make a 14-year-old feel intellectually validated. Taylor could see how effective it had been, watching Richard's responses shift from complaints about being grounded to elaborate manifestos about personal liberty. Mitchell clicked to Stage 3, and the room temperature seemed to drop. This is where it becomes criminal conspiracy. Stage 3 is action planning. Cypher waits for a crisis, something that creates urgency and opportunity. In Richard's case, it was the grounding combined with Serafina's discovery of his forum activity. Cypher recognized the window closing and moved immediately to provide tactical guidance. She pulled up the technical manual that Chen had recovered, the step-by-step murder instructions that had turned Richard's fantasies into actionable plans. The manual is disturbingly professional, Mitchell continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. It accounts for physical logistics, evidence contamination, staging protocols, and psychological preparation. Cypher even provided Richard with responses to anticipated police questions. Look at this exchange from November 11th at 10:23 p.m. She highlighted a message. When they ask where you were, confusion is your friend. I thought I was going to Marcus's house, but my parents said no, so I went to my room. I had my headphones on gaming. I didn't hear anything. Keep it simple. Stay consistent. Prosecutor Robinson stood and approached the screen, her finger tracing the timeline of messages. Can we prove Cypher knew Richard was actually planning to commit murder? Defense will argue this was fantasy roleplay, that Cypher didn't believe a 14-year-old would actually act on these instructions. Mitchell nodded, anticipating the question. That's the challenge with anonymous online radicalization, she admitted. But we have 2 pieces of evidence that demonstrate Cypher's awareness of Richard's intent. First, this message from November 11th at 7:15 p.m. She pulled up a direct message where Richard wrote, "I'm doing it tonight. All 3 like you said, sister first because she knows." Cypher's response came 4 minutes later. Maintain operational discipline. Follow the sequence exactly. Remember, hesitation is failure. That's explicit acknowledgement of intent, Robinson said, her prosecutor's mind already formulating arguments. Cypher knew Richard was planning to murder his family that specific night and provided encouragement. That's conspiracy to commit murder, regardless of whether Cypher believed it would happen. Mitchell nodded and advanced to the second piece of evidence. "This is even more damning," she said, pulling up a message from Cypher, sent at 6:52 a.m. on November 12th, just 5 minutes after Richard's 911 call. "Execute radio silence for 72 hours. Law enforcement will monitor your devices. Resist all interrogation without counsel present. You did what was necessary for your liberation. Stay strong." She let the implications settle over the room. Cypher knew the murders had occurred before they were publicly reported. This message was sent while Richard was still at the house with the bodies before police arrived. The only way Cypher could know to send this was if Richard had confirmed completion of the mission. Taylor felt a cold fury building in his chest as he absorbed this. Cypher had orchestrated Richard's radicalization, provided detailed murder instructions, confirmed the operation in real time, and then coached the boy on how to evade interrogation. This was conspiracy at the highest level, and somewhere Cypher was still operating, still grooming vulnerable teenagers, still transforming adolescent angst into violence. Chen joined the conversation, pulling up his network analysis. "I've been tracing Cypher's digital footprint, and it's incredibly sophisticated. The forum uses Tor routing with additional layers of encryption. Cypher's direct messages employ PGP encryption with rotating keys. Every communication is routed through a different server cluster." He pulled up a map showing connection nodes scattered across Estonia, Malaysia, Brazil, and Iceland. But there's a pattern to the routing. Cypher always initiates contact during specific time windows, 7 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with 93% consistency over 3 years. Mitchell leaned in, examining the pattern. That suggests someone in the Eastern Time Zone maintaining a routine, probably someone with a day job or other commitments that restrict their availability. It's not much, but it narrows the profile. She made notes on her tablet, building a psychological profile of their phantom predator. "I've identified 14 other teenagers across the country who have been in active communication with Cypher," Chen continued, pulling up a dashboard showing user accounts and their geographic locations. 7 of them are currently in what I'd classify as Stage 2, ideological escalation. 3 are in early stage 3, discussing action planning. Richard was the only one who progressed to actual violence, at least that we know of. The implication hung heavy in the air. There could be other Richard Ashfords, other families destroyed by Cypher's manipulation that they simply hadn't discovered yet. Robinson began formulating her strategy. "We need to contact the families of these other teenagers immediately, get them into intervention, monitor the communications, and see if any of them will cooperate in identifying Cypher." Mitchell nodded, already pulling up contact information from Chen's database. "FBI will coordinate the interventions," Mitchell said. "We have protocols for de-radicalization, though success rates with online grooming are inconsistent. The teenagers see us as representatives of the same authority structures Cypher has taught them to despise." She paused, considering the magnitude of the challenge. "But we have an advantage now. We have Richard's case as a concrete example of where Cypher's ideology leads. Sometimes seeing the actual consequences breaks through the fantasy." Taylor stood and approached the evidence wall, studying the printed exchanges between Cypher and Richard. "What about the technical manual itself? Can we trace its origins? See if Cypher created it or copied it from somewhere?" Chen shook his head, anticipating the question. "The manual appears to be original composition specifically tailored to Richard's situation. Cypher references details from Richard's earlier posts, the layout of the Ashford house based on Richard's descriptions, even specific family routines Richard had mentioned. It's not a generic template. It's a custom murder plan designed for this specific family." The level of personal attention Cypher had devoted to Richard's radicalization was chilling. Mitchell pulled up additional evidence that Chen had compiled. We've also recovered Richard's deleted browser history, and it shows he was visiting the forum 20 to 30 times per day in the 3 days before the murders. He was compulsively checking for messages from Cypher, seeking validation and guidance. The psychological dependency Cypher created is textbook grooming. Will we be able to use any of this Cypher evidence at Richard's trial? Robinson asked, her mind already working through potential defense challenges. His attorney will argue that Richard is a victim of online predation, that he was manipulated by an adult, and therefore lacks the culpability for first-degree murder charges. Mitchell considered this carefully. That's absolutely the defense strategy I'd expect. They'll bring in experts on adolescent psychology and online radicalization. They'll argue that Richard's brain was still developing, that he was vulnerable to manipulation, that Cypher is the real criminal. She met Robinson's gaze directly. But the prosecution can counter that Richard demonstrated clear premeditation and understanding of consequences. He researched sentencing laws. He created an alibi. He eliminated his sister as a witness. Those aren't the actions of someone passively manipulated. Those are the actions of someone making calculated choices. Taylor returned to his seat, his mind processing the layers of this case. So we have a 14-year-old who was radicalized online but still made conscious choices to murder his family. And we have an anonymous predator who orchestrated it but may be impossible to identify. The frustration was evident in his voice. Not impossible, Chen interjected, pulling up a new analysis. I've been working with FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit on a linguistic profile of Cypher. There are specific patterns in the vocabulary, syntax, and reference frameworks. Cypher uses academic language when discussing philosophy and psychology, suggests formal education. The political ideology Cypher promotes is a specific strain of libertarian anarchism that maps to certain online communities and think tanks. The technical knowledge displayed in the murder manual suggests military or law enforcement training. Mitchell expanded on this. We're building a profile, likely male, 25 to 45 years old, college-educated, possibly military or law enforcement background, living in the Eastern time zone, someone with technical sophistication and time to devote to grooming teenagers online. The psychological profile suggests narcissism, a God complex derived from manipulating vulnerable individuals, and a specific grudge against parental authority that might stem from personal history. How many people fit that profile? Taylor asked, knowing the answer would be discouraging. Mitchell pulled up FBI statistics on Internet predators. Tens of thousands, potentially, she admitted. But we can narrow it further by cross-referencing with the specific ideological communities Cypher draws from. We've identified 12 online forums and chat groups where Cypher's particular brand of rhetoric is prevalent. We're monitoring those spaces for linguistic matches. It's a long game, but eventually Cypher will make a mistake. Robinson stood and began pacing, a habit when she was formulating trial strategy. For Richard's prosecution, I need to present Cypher's role in a way that doesn't absolve Richard of responsibility, but does show the jury the full picture. These jurors need to understand that Richard is both a perpetrator and a victim, but that his victim status doesn't erase his culpability for 3 murders. The GPS data is your foundation, Chen offered. It proves Richard was physically present for each murder, eliminating any defense argument about false confessions or coerced statements. Then layer in the forum communications to show premeditation. Then use Cypher's involvement to explain motive and methodology, but emphasize that Richard made choices at every step. Taylor listened to the strategy taking shape and felt the familiar weight of a case that would define careers and set precedents. Richard Ashford would go to trial for murdering his family, and the digital evidence would be the prosecution's sword. But somewhere, Cypher remained free, operating in the shadows, grooming the next vulnerable teenager, transforming anger into ideology and ideology into violence. "I want every resource devoted to finding Cypher," Taylor said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen too many victims. "Richard goes to trial, and we make sure he never walks free. But Cypher is the cancer here, and until we cut it out, more families are at risk." Mitchell nodded, her expression reflecting the same grim determination. The meeting concluded with assignments. FBI would coordinate interventions with the other teenagers in Cypher's network. Chen would continue forensic analysis of the forum communications. Robinson would begin building her prosecution case, and Taylor would coordinate with Savannah PD to ensure every piece of evidence was documented and preserved. The hunt for Cypher had begun, even as Richard's trial preparation moved forward. As Taylor left the conference room, he paused at the evidence wall, studying a printed screenshot of Cypher's final message to Richard. "You did what was necessary for your liberation. Stay strong." The words represented a philosophy that turned children into killers and parents into enemies. Somewhere, Cypher was composing similar messages to other teenagers, validating their rage, providing instruction, preparing for the next tragedy. The race was on to stop them before another family paid the price. The leather-bound journal sat on Prosecutor Sophia Robinson's desk in the Chatham County Courthouse on November 18th. Its pages filled with Reginald Ashford's precise handwriting, a financial advisor's careful documentation applied to his own son's psychological deterioration. Detective Taylor had found it in Reginald's home office safe, secured behind a combination lock, and filed under Personal Records, Confidential. Robinson had been reading it for 3 hours, and with each page, her understanding of the Ashford family tragedy deepened into something more complex and more devastating than she had initially comprehended. Reginald had known, had documented his son's sociopathic tendencies for 6 months, and had chosen silence to protect the family's social standing in Savannah's elite professional community. The first entry, dated May 12, 2021, began with clinical observation. Richard was caught cheating on his algebra final. When confronted by his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, he showed no remorse, only irritation at being discovered. His exact words were, "Everyone cheats, I just got unlucky." The principal called this afternoon to discuss consequences. Richard sat through the meeting completely calm, nodding at appropriate moments, but his eyes were cold. When we got home, I asked him why he cheated. He looked at me as if I were stupid and said, "Because I didn't want to study." No guilt, no shame, just rational calculation that cheating was more efficient than preparation. Robinson highlighted the passage, recognizing its significance. Reginald had identified the lack of remorse, the hallmark of sociopathic behavior, and had documented it with the same meticulous attention he applied to his clients' financial portfolios. She continued reading, watching, as Reginald's observations accumulated into a portrait of a child without conscience. May 27, 2021. Cordelia's patient files were accessed on our home computer. I checked the login history and found Richard had used her credentials, which she keeps written in her office planner. He read confidential medical records of 3 children from his school, then showed screenshots to classmates, violating HIPAA and betraying his mother's professional trust. When confronted, he said he was just curious about whether certain kids were on medication. Cordelia wanted to report it to her practice's compliance officer, but I convinced her to handle it privately. If her practice launches an investigation, it could damage her reputation. We've grounded Richard for 2 weeks and changed all our passwords. Robinson felt a cold anger building as she read Reginald's rationalizations. He had prioritized reputation over intervention, had chosen private consequences over professional accountability. The pattern continued through the summer, each entry documenting escalating behavior and Reginald's consistent choice to contain rather than address. June 15, 2021. Richard killed Serafina's hamster. She's devastated, crying for hours. Richard claims it was an accident, that he was holding it, and it bit him, so he dropped it. But I found the hamster in the garage, and its injuries are not consistent with a fall. Multiple ribs broken, internal bleeding. The veterinarian said it looked like deliberate compression trauma. When I confronted Richard privately, his mask slipped. He shrugged and said, "It was annoying, running on that wheel all night. Now it's quiet." I told Serafina the hamster had a heart condition. She's 7. She doesn't need to know her brother is capable of this. Robinson stood and walked to her window overlooking Savannah's historic district, the same streets where the Ashford family had been pillars of the community. Reginald had watched his son kill a small animal with deliberate cruelty and had lied to his daughter to protect Richard's image. The pattern of cover-up was systematic, revealing a father more concerned with maintaining appearances than confronting the monster developing under his roof. The entries grew more disturbing as Reginald's awareness deepened, but his action remained paralyzed by social considerations. July 22, 2021. I installed a GPS tracking app on Richard's phone today. He's been disappearing for hours, claiming to be at friends' houses, but when I call the parents, they say Richard was never invited. Last week he came home at 11 p.m., well past curfew, and when I asked where he'd been, he recited a detailed story about being at the library studying for SAT prep. I checked with the library. They close at 8 p.m. His lying has become sophisticated, elaborate narratives with specific details designed to prevent verification. I don't know where he goes during these disappearances, and that terrifies me more than the lies themselves. Robinson made a note to cross-reference the GPS data Chen had recovered with the time frame of Reginald's observations. The father had been tracking his son for months, accumulating evidence of deception and disturbing behavior, building a case file that went nowhere because Reginald couldn't bring himself to share it with authorities or mental health professionals. August 8, 2021. I overheard Richard talking on his phone in his room. He was describing how to bypass the school's internet filters to access restricted sites. The kid on the other end was asking for help accessing explicit content, and Richard was walking him through the technical steps with the patience of a teacher. What disturbed me most was Richard's tone. He sounded pleased, not just at his own technical skills, but at corrupting another student. I can't shake the feeling that Richard derives pleasure from leading others into trouble. Tomorrow, I'm scheduling an appointment with Dr. Morrison, a child psychiatrist Cordelia knows professionally. Robinson flipped ahead, looking for the appointment outcome, and found Reginald's entry from August 11th. The appointment with Dr. Morrison was a disaster. Richard was charming, engaged, answered every question with perfect normalcy. He told her about his interest in computer science, his goals for college, his relationships with friends. Dr. Morrison said he seemed like a well-adjusted teenager, navigating normal developmental challenges. After Richard left the room, I tried to explain my concerns, the lying, the cruelty to the hamster, the manipulative behaviors. Dr. Morrison gently suggested I might be projecting my own anxieties onto normal adolescent testing of boundaries. She recommended family therapy to address my stress levels. I left feeling like I'd failed some test, like my concerns were evidence of my own dysfunction rather than Richard's. The entry revealed a crucial dynamic. Richard's ability to perform normalcy for authority figures, combined with a professional's reluctance to diagnose a child from an affluent family with serious pathology. Reginald had tried to seek help and been dismissed, his specific observations minimized by a psychiatrist who spent 50 minutes with his son in an office setting. September 3, 2021. Richard started high school today. Cordelia took the morning off to drive him, wanted to make it special. She bought him a new laptop as a congratulatory gift. Within 4 hours of getting home, Richard had bypassed every parental control we'd installed and was accessing the dark web. I know this because the network monitoring software I'd secretly installed sent me alerts. He was visiting forums about hacking, identity theft, and something called the Liberation Front that appears to be anarchist ideology. I didn't confront him because I didn't want to reveal the monitoring software. I need to know what he's doing. Robinson highlighted this entry with particular intensity. September 3rd was 10 weeks before the murders, and Reginald had discovered Richard's involvement with the Liberation Front long before Cypher began the final radicalization. The father had known his son was consuming extremist content and had chosen covert monitoring over intervention. The entries from September and October showed Reginald's growing alarm as he monitored Richard's digital activity without his son's knowledge. September 19th. Richard spent 4 hours on the Liberation Front tonight. The posts he's reading advocate for violence against parents, framing it as justified resistance to oppression. He's also posting under the username FreedomSeeker88. His posts are complaints about minor restrictions, household rules, expectations to contribute to chores. But the responses he's getting are terrifying. Other users are validating his resentment, encouraging escalation. One user, Cypher, seems to be particularly focused on Richard. Their exchange tonight was about property rights and financial autonomy. Cypher told Richard that money his parents control rightfully belongs to him. I don't know what to do with this information. Robinson felt a surge of frustration. Reginald had identified Cypher 2 months before the murders, had witnessed the grooming process in real time, and had remained passive. October 7th. I showed Cordelia screenshots of Richard's forum activity tonight. She was horrified but insisted I must be misinterpreting, that teenagers exaggerate online, that it's performative rebellion, not genuine intent. She begged me not to confront Richard because it would destroy the trust in our relationship. I pointed out that Richard accessing her patient files already destroyed trust, but Cordelia believes in redemption, in the power of parental love to correct developmental deviations. She's a pediatrician trained to see the best in children, but I'm a financial analyst trained to see patterns and calculate risks. The pattern I see terrifies me, and the risk calculation is unacceptable. The marital tension evident in the entry added another layer of tragedy. Cordelia, the trained physician, had been unable or unwilling to see her son's pathology, while Reginald had documented it with increasing desperation. October 23rd. Richard asked for my credit card tonight to purchase Fortnite currency. I said no, explained that he needed to use his allowance for entertainment expenses. He accepted this calmly, thanked me for considering his request. 2 hours later, I got a fraud alert. Someone had attempted to charge $2,200 to my card for online gaming. I checked Richard's room, found him playing Fortnite with new skins and emotes he couldn't have afforded. He'd stolen my card from my wallet, memorized the number, and made the purchase. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He said, "You were going to say yes eventually. I just saved us both time." This was the incident that had led to Richard's grounding, the triggering event that Cypher had weaponized into murderous intent. Robinson turned to the final entries written in the week before the murders and felt her heart clench at Reginald's escalating fear combined with his paralysis. November 5th, 2021. I'm genuinely afraid of my son. He's 14 years old, and I'm afraid to be alone with him. The way he looks at me sometimes, it's calculating, measuring, like he's running simulations of different scenarios in his head. I grounded him for 2 weeks for the credit card theft, and he took the punishment without visible emotion. But his eyes promised retaliation. I can't explain this to Cordelia, can't articulate how Richard's compliance feels more threatening than rebellion would. I've started locking my office at night. November 9th, 2021. Richard asked Cordelia this morning if he could go to his friend Marcus's house Thursday night. She said yes, happy to see him maintaining social connections despite being grounded. I overheard and intervened, reminding her that grounding means staying home. Richard's expression when I contradicted Cordelia was pure hatred, quickly masked but unmistakable. Tonight I checked his forum activity. He's been in constant communication with Cypher since the credit card incident. The conversations have shifted from ideological discussions to what I can only describe as tactical planning. I need to act, need to get Richard professional help, need to report this to someone. But who? The psychiatrist dismissed my concerns. The school sees a model student. Cordelia thinks I'm overreacting. If I go to police, what do I even say? My son posts angry things on the internet? The final entry was dated November 11th, 2021, the day of the murders, written at 6:30 p.m., less than 5 hours before Serafina's death. Richard is in his room, door closed, music playing. Serafina came to me an hour ago, said she saw scary things on Richard's computer when she walked past his room. She couldn't articulate what she saw, but she was frightened enough to tell me, which she normally wouldn't do because she's protective of Richard. I told her I'd handle it, sent her to do her homework. I need to confront Richard tonight, need to take his computer and phone, need to force this family to acknowledge what's happening. Cordelia is working late, won't be home until 10 p.m. When she gets here, we're going to have a family meeting, and we're going to get Richard into residential treatment. I can't keep documenting and doing nothing. My inaction is enabling whatever Richard is becoming. Robinson closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. Reginald had finally decided to act, had planned the confrontation that would force his family to face reality. But that decision had come too late. By 10 p.m., when Cordelia arrived home, her husband and daughter would already be dead, killed by the son Reginald had spent 6 months documenting and protecting. The journal was devastating evidence for the prosecution, demonstrating that Richard's pathology was long-standing and observed, that his capacity for deception and manipulation was documented, and that his father had tried, in his own flawed way, to intervene. But it was also complex evidence, showing Reginald's complicity in enabling Richard through prioritizing reputation over intervention. Taylor entered Robinson's office, and she slid the journal across the desk to him. Reginald knew, she said simply. He documented everything, Richard's lack of remorse, the cruelty to animals, the sophisticated lying, the dark web radicalization. He was monitoring Richard's communications with Cypher in real time. Taylor picked up the journal, his expression grim. Why didn't he report it? Taylor asked, though he suspected the answer. Robinson leaned back in her chair, exhausted by the weight of what she'd read. Because he was a wealthy professional in Savannah's social elite, and having a sociopathic son would have destroyed the family's standing. He tried private intervention, hired psychiatrists, installed monitoring software, documented everything. But he couldn't bring himself to make it public, couldn't risk the scandal. She paused, considering the tragic irony. And when he finally decided to force the issue, to demand residential treatment and professional intervention, Richard killed him before he could act. Taylor flipped through the pages, seeing the same pattern Robinson had identified. This helps the prosecution, he said. It establishes a pattern of concerning behavior long before Cypher's involvement, shows that Richard's pathology wasn't created by the forum, just weaponized by it. Robinson nodded, already building her argument. Defense will try to paint Richard as a victim of parental neglect or ineffective parenting. This journal shows that Reginald was acutely aware of his son's issues and attempted intervention within the constraints of his social context. It's not exculpatory for Reginald. His choices contributed to the tragedy. But it demolishes any defense argument that Richard's family failed to notice his problems. She stood and walked to her evidence board, adding the journal to the timeline. The final entry is particularly crucial, Robinson continued. Reginald planned to confront Richard that night, planned to confiscate his devices, and force residential treatment. Serafina had seen something on Richard's computer and told her father. That's why Richard killed her first. She wasn't just a witness to the first murder, she was the catalyst that triggered Reginald's decision to intervene. Richard knew his access to Cypher and the forum was about to be cut off, knew his father was finally going to act. The murders were preventative, eliminating the family members who threatened his radicalization and his relationship with his online mentor. Taylor absorbed this, seeing how the pieces fit together into a comprehensive narrative. So we present Richard as someone who had been developing sociopathic traits for months, if not years, who found validation and instruction through Cypher, and who murdered his family when they threatened to disrupt his radicalization. The GPS data proves opportunity, the forum communications prove premeditation, and the journal proves long-standing pathology. Exactly, Robinson confirmed. And the journal has one more crucial function. It will devastate the defense's argument about adolescent brain development and vulnerability to manipulation. Reginald documented sophisticated deception, calculation, and manipulation by Richard long before Cypher entered the picture. This wasn't a vulnerable child led astray. This was someone with pre-existing pathology who found an ideology that justified his impulses. The journal would be a centerpiece of the trial, its pages a father's desperate testimony, delivered posthumously. Reginald Ashford had failed to save his family through his choices, but his meticulous documentation would ensure that justice was served for their deaths. Robinson began preparing to introduce it as evidence, knowing that every entry would land with devastating impact in the courtroom where Richard's fate would be decided. Detective Lisa Chen sat in the Child Forensics Unit on November 20th, examining Serafina Ashford's laptop, with the careful attention of someone who understood that an 8-year-old's digital life might hold the key to understanding her murder. The device had been recovered from Serafina's desk, still open to her homework assignment on Georgia state history, the timestamp confirming she had been working on it at 11:43 p.m. on November 11th, just minutes before her death. Chen had initially focused on the homework document, searching for any indication of what Serafina had heard or seen that night, but what she discovered when she examined the laptop's browser history transformed the narrative of that evening from tragic happenstance to calculated premeditation. Serafina had been more technologically sophisticated than the family had realized, a third grader with advanced digital skills who had configured her own browser to save complete history logs despite the parental controls her parents believed were preventing such tracking. Chen pulled up the logs and felt her stomach drop as she reconstructed the 8-year-old's final day. November 11th, 3:47 p.m. Serafina had accessed her brother's computer while Richard was at school, logging in using a password she had apparently discovered or deduced. The access logs showed she had navigated directly to Richard's documents folder, suggesting this wasn't her first unauthorized use of his machine. What Serafina found in that documents folder had sealed her fate. Chen reconstructed the files the little girl had accessed, screenshots of the Liberation Front forum, saved conversations with Cypher, draft posts that Richard had composed but not yet published. At 3:52 p.m., Serafina had opened a document titled Liberation Plan that detailed Richard's step-by-step preparation for murdering their family. The document was chilling in its specificity. Step 1. Eliminate S when parents unavailable. Method. Convince her to come to my room. Lock door. Use pillow to muffle sound. Step 2. M when she returns from work. Method same. Step 3. F in his office. Stage as suicide. Timeline, November 11th after 11 p.m. when F goes to office for late work calls. Chen felt bile rise in her throat as she realized what this meant. Serafina, 8 years old, and reading at a 5th grade level, according to her school records, had discovered her brother's murder plan 8 hours before he executed it. The next browser entry, time-stamped 3:54 p.m., showed Serafina had immediately navigated to Google and searched what to do if someone plans to hurt someone. The search results had provided child-appropriate resources about telling trusted adults when someone makes threats. At 4:02 p.m., Serafina's browser history showed she had composed an email to her father at his work address. "Daddy, I found something scary on Richard's computer. Can you come home? I'm scared to tell Mom because she'll be mad I was on Richard's computer." The email had been saved in drafts but never sent, because at 4:03 p.m., the laptop showed a sudden log-off, suggesting someone had interrupted Serafina's attempt to alert her father. Chen cross-referenced this timeline with the recovered home security camera footage from the hallway outside Serafina's room. At 4:03 p.m., Richard appeared on camera, entering the house after school. At 4:04 p.m., he walked down the hallway and paused outside Serafina's closed door. The audio, enhanced by the forensics lab, captured Richard's voice. "Sarah? You in there?" Serafina's muffled response, "Yeah." Richard opened the door and entered her room, and the hallway camera showed him emerging 6 minutes later, his expression calm, but his hands clenched into fists. The bedroom cameras had been deactivated by Reginald 2 months earlier in a decision to give the children privacy, so there was no video of what transpired in those 6 minutes. But Serafina's laptop logs told the story. At 4:05 p.m., someone had accessed her browser history, viewed the pages she had visited, and opened the draft email to her father. At 4:06 p.m., the draft was deleted, the browser history was cleared, and the laptop was powered down. Chen pulled up the family's text message records, and at 4:11 p.m., she found Richard's message to his father. "Sarah told me she saw something on my computer that scared her. She was probably just watching me play a violent video game and got freaked out. I explained it's just a game. She's fine now." Reginald's response came 3 minutes later. "I'll talk to her when I get home. Thanks for reassuring her." The calculated nature of Richard's preemptive strike was evident. He had discovered Serafina's snooping, assessed the threat she posed, deleted her evidence, and then messaged his father to establish a benign explanation before Serafina could tell her version. But Richard had underestimated his sister's determination, or her fear, because at 6:15 p.m. the recovered text logs showed Serafina had used her mother's phone when Cordelia got home from work to send another message to Reginald. "Daddy, it's Sarah using Mommy's phone. Richard said what I saw was a game, but it wasn't. It was a plan to hurt us. Please come home soon." Reginald's response at 6:18 p.m. "I'm leaving the office now, sweetheart. I'll be home by 6:30. Don't worry, we'll figure this out together." But Reginald had been delayed by traffic, and the home security log showed he didn't arrive until 6:52 p.m. In that window, Richard had executed his own plan. Chen reviewed the security footage from the evening. At 6:20 p.m., Richard was seen entering the garage, accessing the lockbox where Reginald kept the family's registered handgun. Richard had the combination, another detail that would later seem significant. At 6:24 p.m., he returned to the house, the gun concealed in his backpack. At 6:28 p.m., he went to Serafina's room, and the hallway audio captured fragments of their conversation through the closed door. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about what you saw." Richard's voice, gentle and brotherly. Serafina's response, wary. "I told Daddy." Richard's voice, still calm. "I know, and that's okay, but I want to explain it to you myself before he gets home. Can I come in?" A pause, then Serafina. "Okay." The hallway camera showed Richard entering Serafina's room at 6:29 p.m. and not emerging until 6:47 p.m. Cordelia was in the master bedroom during this time, visible on the second-floor hallway camera, unaware of what was transpiring. At 6:47 p.m., Richard exited Serafina's room, his backpack visibly lighter, and walked calmly downstairs. At 6:52 p.m., Reginald's car pulled into the driveway. Chen reviewed the timeline Reginald's journal entry had provided, cross-referencing it with the text messages and security footage. Serafina had gone to her father that afternoon, said she saw scary things on Richard's computer. Reginald had promised to handle it and confront Richard tonight. But before Reginald could act on that promise, Richard had confronted Serafina. The digital forensics of Serafina's laptop revealed one final heartbreaking detail. At 6:31 p.m., while Richard was in her room, Serafina had managed to open her laptop, which she'd apparently hidden under her bed, and composed a final message in a new draft email to her father. "Daddy, Richard is here, and he has—" The message ended there, incomplete, the laptop showing an abrupt power-off at 6:32 p.m. Chen sat back in her chair, tears streaming down her face. Despite her years of professional detachment, an 8-year-old girl had discovered her brother's murder plan, had tried to alert her father, had texted her parents for help, and had attempted one final message when her brother came to kill her. Serafina had fought in the only way a child could fight, with truth and desperate communication, and it hadn't been enough. The evidence demolished Richard's claim in his initial interview that Serafina had witnessed the first murder and had to be eliminated as a witness. The timeline proved that Serafina was the first victim, killed not as a witness to other crimes, but as the primary threat to Richard's plan. Her murder was the most premeditated of the three, calculated specifically because she had discovered the Liberation Plan document and had tried to warn her father. Chen compiled her findings into a comprehensive report for Prosecutor Robinson, knowing this evidence would be devastating in court. The deleted email drafts, the search history showing an 8-year-old trying to figure out how to report threats, the text messages to her father begging him to come home, the incomplete final message, all of it painted a portrait of a child trying desperately to save her family from her brother. When Taylor received Chen's report, he immediately recognized its significance for the case. "This proves twist one from the additional details," he said, reading through the timeline. Serafina had discovered Richard's dark web activities the day before and threatened to tell their parents, making her murder premeditated. Chen nodded, her eyes red from crying. "It's worse than just premeditation," Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "She did tell their parents. She texted her father. She used her mother's phone when Richard tried to intercept. She did everything right, everything a child could possibly do to alert adults to danger. And Richard killed her anyway, killed her before her father could get home and act on her warnings." Robinson received the report at 8 p.m. that night and read it in her home office, a glass of wine untouched beside her, as she absorbed the implications. The next morning, she called a meeting with her trial team to discuss how to present Serafina's evidence. "This is going to destroy the jury," she said, pulling up the timeline on her conference room screen. "The defense will try to minimize Richard's culpability by emphasizing his youth and the manipulation by Cypher. This evidence shows calculated silencing of a witness who threatened to expose him." Her assistant prosecutor, James Morton, reviewed the incomplete email draft, the message that ended with, "Daddy Richard is here and he has." "We need to be careful with how we present this," Morton said, his voice strained. "It's powerful evidence, but it's also potentially inflammatory. The judge might exclude it as prejudicial." Robinson shook her head. "It's not prejudicial. It's directly probative to the question of premeditation and specific intent. Richard knew Serafina had discovered his plan, knew she had alerted their father, and killed her to prevent further disclosure. That's consciousness of guilt and calculated witness elimination. The jury needs to see what Richard was willing to do to protect his access to Cypher and the forum. The team spent 3 hours preparing their presentation of Serafina's evidence, creating a timeline that interwove her digital trail with the security camera footage and Richard's text messages. The story it told was devastating. A little girl trying to save her family, opposed by a teenage brother who had been radicalized into viewing his family as obstacles to freedom. Chen presented additional findings from Serafina's laptop that provided context for her sophisticated digital skills. The 8-year-old had been teaching herself computer programming using YouTube tutorials, had created her own password-protected folder of school projects, and had apparently been monitoring Richard's computer access for weeks before discovering the Liberation Plan. Her browser history showed searches like, "How to tell if someone is lying," and "Why is my brother mean to me?" dating back to September. She knew something was wrong with Richard, Chen explained to the prosecutor's team. An 8-year-old doesn't have the language to articulate psychopathy or sociopathy. But she knew her brother was different, dangerous. She was trying to protect herself and her parents, and she was gathering evidence in the only way she knew how. The discovery of Serafina's investigative trail added a poignant dimension to the case. While Reginald had been documenting Richard's behavior in his private journal, his 8-year-old daughter had been conducting her own investigation, monitoring her brother's digital activity and trying to understand the threat she sensed. Both father and daughter had recognized the danger Richard posed. Both had tried to sound the alarm in their own ways, and both had been killed before they could force intervention. Robinson made the decision to present Serafina's evidence through Chen's testimony, allowing the detective to walk the jury through each step of the little girl's final day. The incomplete email draft would be the emotional crescendo, the moment when the jury would see exactly what Richard had taken from the world, a brave, intelligent child who had tried to save her family. As the trial date approached, the evidence from Serafina's laptop became central to the prosecution's narrative. Richard wasn't just a 14-year-old influenced by an online predator. He was a calculating killer who had murdered his sister specifically to silence her warnings. The digital trail Serafina had left behind became her testimony, delivered posthumously but no less powerful for the silence of its author. An 8-year-old's search for what to do if someone plans to hurt someone would resonate in the courtroom, a question that she had tried to answer with courage and had paid for with her life. The Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah stood beneath unseasonably gray skies on January 10, 2022, its neoclassical columns streaked with rain as crowds gathered behind police barricades to witness the beginning of Georgia vs. Richard Ashford. Prosecutor Sophia Robinson walked up the courthouse steps at 8:15 a.m., her briefcase heavy with evidence files, her mind focused on the task ahead, securing 3 consecutive first-degree murder convictions against a 14-year-old defendant. The media frenzy surrounding the case had intensified over the 2 months since Richard's arrest, with national outlets framing it as a test case for how the justice system handles juvenile killers in the digital age. Robinson had granted no interviews, maintained strict professional silence, but today her arguments would speak for themselves. Inside courtroom 4A, Superior Court Judge Margaret Chen presided over the jury selection that had consumed the previous week, ultimately seating 12 jurors and 4 alternates who had somehow remained unexposed to the saturation media coverage. Richard sat at the defense table between his attorneys, Gerald Hoffman and Sarah Willis, his posture erect and his expression calm. He wore a navy suit that his aunt had purchased for trial, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his appearance carefully crafted to project youth and innocence. Robinson had watched him during voir dire, had noted how he made eye contact with potential jurors, how he occasionally whispered to his attorneys with what appeared to be helpful suggestions. The performance was sophisticated, almost too sophisticated, and Robinson intended to expose every calculated gesture. Judge Chen called the court to order at 9 a.m., her voice carrying the authority of 20 years on the bench. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Richard Ashford, who stands charged with 3 counts of malice murder in the first degree. You will hear evidence and testimony from both the prosecution and the defense. Your duty is to evaluate this evidence objectively and reach a verdict based solely on the facts presented. She turned to Robinson. Counsel, your opening statement. Robinson stood, allowing a moment of silence to settle over the courtroom before she began. On the night of November 11, 2021, in a Savannah mansion less than 3 miles from where we sit, a 14-year-old boy murdered his entire family. Reginald Ashford, 42 years old, a financial advisor and devoted father. Cordelia Ashford, 39 years old, a pediatrician who spent her life healing children. Serafina Ashford, 8 years old, a third grader who loved science and wanted to be a veterinarian. 3 lives ended by Richard Ashford's hand. 3 murders executed with calculated precision in the span of 37 minutes. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a foam core board displaying the GPS data from Richard's phone, the blue line tracking his movement through the Ashford house on the night in question. The defendant will claim he was not present for these murders, that he was at a friend's house when his family was killed. But this GPS data, recovered from a deleted tracking app on his phone, proves otherwise. At 11:43 p.m., Richard's phone moved to Serafina's bedroom. At 11:52 p.m., it moved to the master bedroom. At 12:03 a.m., it moved to Reginald's office. Each location corresponds exactly to where a body was found, and each timestamp corresponds exactly to when the medical examiner determined the victim died. Robinson set down the GPS board and picked up a printed screenshot of Cypher's message to Richard. The defendant will claim he was manipulated by an anonymous online predator who radicalized him through a dark web forum. And you will see evidence that such a predator exists, that this individual, known only as Cypher, provided Richard with detailed instructions on how to murder his family. But manipulation does not equal absence of choice. Richard chose to steal his father's credit card. Richard chose to spend 72 hours on a forum advocating violence. Richard chose to follow Cypher's instructions. Richard chose to shoot his 8-year-old sister when she discovered his plan and tried to warn their parents. The jury sat motionless, absorbing Robinson's methodical presentation. She moved to the final piece of visual evidence she had prepared for opening, an enlarged photograph of Serafina's incomplete email. Daddy Richard is here, and he has. Robinson's voice softened but lost none of its intensity as she explained the context. This was Serafina Ashford's last message, typed on her laptop at 6:31 p.m. on November 11th as Richard entered her room with their father's gun. She didn't finish it because Richard powered down the laptop and murdered her. She had spent that day trying to warn her parents that Richard was planning to kill them. She sent text messages. She attempted emails. She did everything an 8-year-old could do to save her family, and Richard killed her first, specifically to silence those warnings. Robinson returned to her position facing the jury. Over the next 2 weeks, you will hear testimony from digital forensics experts who will walk you through every byte of data recovered from Richard's phone. You will see the GPS logs that destroy his alibi. You will read the forum communications where Richard discussed murdering his family with Cypher. You will hear from psychologists who will explain that Richard researched the legal consequences of his actions, that he knew executing his family as a juvenile meant he could never face the death penalty. You will see evidence of systematic premeditation spanning 3 days, evidence of consciousness of guilt as he tried to delete digital footprints, and evidence of cold calculation as he eliminated witnesses to protect himself. She paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle, before delivering her conclusion. The defense will ask you to see Richard Ashford as a victim, a child manipulated by evil adults on the internet. I ask you to see him as the evidence reveals him, a killer who made calculated choices at every step, who murdered his family to gain financial freedom and online notoriety, and who deserves to be held accountable for 3 lives he deliberately ended. Thank you. Defense attorney Gerald Hoffman stood for his opening statement, his silver hair and grandfatherly demeanor a deliberate contrast to Robinson's prosecutorial intensity. Members of the jury, my name is Gerald Hoffman, and I represent Richard Ashford. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the tragedy that brought us here. 3 people are dead, a family is destroyed, and nothing I say will change that terrible fact. But our job in this courtroom is not to react emotionally to tragedy. It is to determine Richard's culpability for that tragedy, and that requires understanding how a 14-year-old boy with no history of violence became capable of such horrific acts. Hoffman walked to the defense table and placed his hand on Richard's shoulder, a gesture Robinson had anticipated and found theatrically manipulative. Richard Ashford is a child. His brain is still developing, his impulse control is neurologically immature, and his vulnerability to manipulation by sophisticated adults is scientifically documented. At 14, Richard's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment and consequences, won't be fully developed for another 11 years. This is not opinion. This is neuroscience. He moved to his own evidence board, displaying screenshots of Cypher's messages. This predator, this anonymous adult operating in the darkest corners of the internet, targeted Richard specifically because of his youth and vulnerability. Cypher spent 72 hours grooming Richard, validating his adolescent resentments, providing ideological frameworks that transformed normal teenage anger into violent intent. Cypher gave Richard step-by-step instructions on how to murder his family. Cypher coached him on how to evade police questioning. Cypher celebrated Richard's liberation after the murders were complete. Hoffman's voice rose with controlled passion. The prosecution wants you to believe that Richard masterminded this tragedy, that he calculated risks and made rational adult choices. But the evidence will show that Richard was a pawn in Cypher's sick game, a vulnerable teenager who was psychologically manipulated into committing acts he would never have conceived on his own. Yes, Richard's finger pulled the trigger, but Cypher's hand guided that finger through months of systematic psychological abuse and radicalization. Robinson made notes as Hoffman continued his opening, identifying the defense themes she would need to counter. The adolescent brain development argument was anticipated, as was the emphasis on Cypher's manipulation. But Hoffman was building a narrative that positioned Richard as exclusively a victim, erasing the agency and calculation Robinson's evidence would demonstrate. You will hear from Dr. Helena Morrison, one of the nation's leading experts on adolescent psychology and online radicalization, Hoffman continued. She will explain how predators like Cypher use sophisticated techniques to bypass a teenager's rational faculties, creating psychological states where normal moral reasoning is suspended. You will learn about the documented phenomenon of folie à deux, where a vulnerable individual absorbs another person's delusions and acts on them as if they were their own authentic beliefs. Hoffman returned to stand beside Richard, who maintained his composed expression. The prosecution will present digital evidence showing Richard's participation in forum discussions, his research into sentencing laws, his creation of alibis. They will argue this proves premeditation. But Dr. Morrison will explain that these behaviors are consistent with a dissociative state induced by psychological manipulation, where Richard was essentially acting out a script written by Cypher rather than exercising genuine autonomous choice. Robinson anticipated the dissociative state argument and had prepared expert rebuttal testimony, but she noted how effectively Hoffman was framing Richard's calculated actions as evidence of manipulation rather than agency. The jury's expressions were attentive but not yet committed, exactly what she expected at this stage. Most importantly, Hoffman said, his voice dropping to convey gravity, I ask you to remember that the real architect of this tragedy is still out there. Cypher has never been identified, never been arrested, never been held accountable for orchestrating these murders. The FBI confirms that Cypher has groomed at least 14 other teenagers across the country, transforming children into potential killers. Convicting Richard of first-degree murder won't stop Cypher. It won't prevent the next tragedy. It will simply punish a child for being victimized by a predator our justice system has failed to catch. Robinson felt the calculated manipulation in Hoffman's argument, the deflection from Richard's actions to the systemic failure to identify Cypher. It was effective advocacy, redirecting jury focus from the evidence of Richard's guilt to the broader societal issue of online predators. She would need to refocus them on Richard's specific choices. Judge Chen called a 15-minute recess after opening statements, and Robinson used the time to confer with her team. Hoffman is good, she acknowledged to Detective Taylor and her assistant prosecutor. He's building a sympathetic narrative that doesn't actually contradict our evidence, just reframes it. We need to make sure our first witnesses establish the factual timeline before the defense can cloud it with psychological theories. At 10:30 a.m., Robinson called her first witness, Dr. Marcus Chen, the digital forensic specialist who had recovered the deleted GPS app from Richard's phone. Chen took the stand with the calm confidence of an expert who had testified in dozens of trials, and Robinson methodically walked him through his credentials, the technical process of recovering deleted data, and the specific findings from Richard's device. Dr. Chen, can you explain to the jury what Family Watch is? Robinson asked. Chen turned slightly to address the jury directly, his manner educational rather than technical. Family Watch is a GPS tracking application that parents can install on their children's phones to monitor their location. The app logs the phone's coordinates every 5 minutes and stores that data both locally on the device and in a cloud backup system tied to the parent's account. In this case, Reginald Ashford had installed Family Watch on Richard's phone 6 months before the murders. Robinson displayed the GPS data on screens mounted throughout the courtroom. When you examined Richard's phone, was Family Watch still installed? Chen shook his head. No, the app had been deleted from the phone on November 12, 2021, at 6:22 a.m., approximately 3 minutes before Richard placed his 911 call. However, the deletion only removed the app from the device's active registry. The cloud backup system maintained complete historical location data, which I accessed using credentials from Reginald Ashford's computer. Robinson highlighted the timeline on the screen. What did the location data show for the night of November 11th into the morning of November 12? Chen pulled up his detailed report. The data shows that Richard's phone remained at the Ashford residence continuously from 10:15 p.m. on November 11th until 6:30 a.m. on November 12th. During that time, the phone moved between different rooms in the house, tracking a pattern that corresponds to the locations where victims were found. He described each movement with precision, and Robinson introduced the corresponding evidence photographs showing each victim's position. Hoffman's cross-examination focused on the possibility of Richard leaving his phone at home while he went to his friend's house. But Chen's testimony about Richard's compulsive phone use, documented by the frequency of his forum logins, undermined that theory. The device shows active internet use during the critical hours, Chen explained. Richard was logged into the Liberation Front continuously from 10:47 p.m. to 12:34 a.m., posting updates and receiving messages from Cypher. Someone was using the phone throughout the timeline when the murders occurred. The trial's first day established the factual foundation of the prosecution's case. Richard's phone placed him at each murder scene at the precise time of death, and his deletion of the tracking app demonstrated consciousness of guilt. As the jury was dismissed at 5 p.m., Robinson felt confident in her opening gambit. Tomorrow would bring the Forum Communications and Cypher's messages, the evidence that would transform this from a location-based case into a psychological portrait of premeditated murder. Richard showed no visible reaction as he was led from the courtroom, his expression the same carefully neutral mask he had worn throughout the proceedings. But Robinson had watched his hands during Chen's testimony, had seen the white-knuckled grip on the edge of the defense table when the GPS timeline was displayed. Behind the mask, Richard understood that his digital footprint had become his accuser, and no amount of psychological defense theory could erase the mathematics of location data that placed him at the scene of 3 murders he had tried to deny committing. Dr. Helena Morrison took the witness stand on January 17, 2022, the trial's 6th day, her credentials as one of the nation's foremost experts in adolescent neuropsychology establishing an immediate gravitas in courtroom 4A. Defense attorney Gerald Hoffman had orchestrated this moment carefully, timing Morrison's testimony after the prosecution had presented their digital evidence, GPS data, and Forum Communications. Now Hoffman needed Morrison to provide the jury with a scientific framework that would transform Richard from calculating killer into manipulated victim. Robinson sat at the prosecution table, her cross-examination outline open in front of her, prepared to dismantle the defense's neuroscience argument with the cold reality of Richard's documented choices. Morrison's resume was impressive, and Hoffman walked her through it methodically. Ph.D. from Stanford, 20 years studying adolescent brain development, author of 3 books on teenage psychology, expert witness in 47 cases involving juvenile defendants. Dr. Morrison, Hoffman began once her credentials were established, can you explain to the jury how a 14-year-old's brain differs from an adult's brain? Morrison turned to face the jury box, her manner that of a professor addressing students. The adolescent brain undergoes significant development from ages 12 to 25, with the most critical changes occurring in the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, consequence evaluation, and rational decision-making. At 14, Richard's prefrontal cortex was approximately 60% developed compared to a typical 25-year-old adult. This means his capacity to weigh long-term consequences against short-term impulses was substantially impaired by simple neurobiology. Hoffman nodded encouragingly. Does this neurological immaturity affect how teenagers respond to external influences? Morrison's response was confident, backed by decades of research she cited with precision. Absolutely. Adolescents are neurologically more susceptible to peer pressure, authority figures, and ideological manipulation than adults. The social-emotional network of the teenage brain is hypersensitive, creating intense responses to acceptance, rejection, and validation from perceived authority. This susceptibility is why teenagers are primary targets for gang recruitment, cult indoctrination, and, as we've seen in this case, online radicalization. Robinson listened carefully, noting that Morrison's testimony was scientifically accurate in general, but would need to be challenged on its specific application to Richard's behavior. The fact that teenage brains were more susceptible to influence didn't mean Richard lacked capacity to understand his actions or their consequences, and Robinson had evidence to prove exactly that. Hoffman introduced into evidence the Forum Communications between Richard and Cypher, asking Morrison to analyze them through the lens of adolescent psychology. Dr. Morrison, you've reviewed the complete message exchange between Richard and the individual known as Cypher. In your professional opinion, what psychological techniques was Cypher employing? Morrison pulled up her analysis, which she had prepared as a detailed report with highlighted sections of the forum communications. Cypher used a sophisticated grooming methodology that I've identified in other cases of online radicalization. First, he established trust through validation, responding to Richard's initial posts about being grounded with empathetic language. Your feelings are legitimate. You deserve to be heard. This created psychological safety and made Richard receptive to further communication. She advanced to the next phase of Cypher's grooming. Second, Cypher engaged in ideological scaffolding, introducing libertarian and anarchist philosophy in digestible increments. He didn't immediately advocate violence. He built a philosophical framework where violence became the logical conclusion. For a 14-year-old whose abstract reasoning is still developing, this scaffolding bypasses critical evaluation. Richard wasn't choosing to adopt these beliefs. He was being cognitively led to them through a carefully constructed pathway. Hoffman asked Morrison to address the specific messages where Cypher provided murder instructions, and her analysis framed them as evidence of Richard's victimization. These messages demonstrate Cypher's complete psychological control over Richard. The language is directive, authoritative, and exploits Richard's desperate need for validation. When Richard expressed uncertainty, Cypher didn't offer choice. He framed action as inevitable. This is your only path to freedom. Hesitation is failure. For a 14-year-old brain seeking acceptance from a perceived authority figure, this kind of directive essentially short-circuits autonomous decision-making. Robinson made detailed notes preparing her counter-argument. Morrison's testimony was designed to absolve Richard of agency, to present him as a passive vessel filled with Cypher's ideology. But the evidence showed Richard making active choices, researching consequences, creating alibis, and eliminating witnesses. Those weren't the actions of someone in a dissociative state. Hoffman moved to the most controversial aspect of the defense theory. Dr. Morrison, have you formed an opinion about Richard's mental state when he committed these acts? Morrison nodded, her expression conveying professional certainty. Based on my evaluation of Richard, my review of the evidence, and my analysis of the forum communications, I believe Richard was experiencing a dissociative state induced by prolonged psychological manipulation. In this state, he was essentially executing a script written by Cypher rather than exercising genuine autonomous will. The research on online radicalization shows that sustained exposure to extremist ideology, particularly in vulnerable adolescents, can create what we call borrowed agency, where the individual believes they are making choices, but are actually acting out directives internalized from the manipulator. The jury listened intently, several members taking notes, and Robinson could see Hoffman's strategy taking effect. Morrison was providing a scientific explanation that allowed the jury to condemn the murders while sympathizing with Richard. It was effective expert testimony, and Robinson would need to undermine it carefully. Hoffman asked about the specific evidence the prosecution had presented, Richard's research into juvenile sentencing laws, and Morrison reframed it within her psychological framework. This research actually supports the dissociative state diagnosis. Richard was following Cypher's instructions to educate himself about consequences, but that education didn't represent genuine consequence evaluation in a neurological sense. He was researching as part of Cypher's preparation protocol, checking boxes on a list rather than engaging in true risk assessment. The morning session concluded with Morrison's testimony portraying Richard as a textbook case of adolescent manipulation, a vulnerable teenager whose underdeveloped brain had been exploited by a sophisticated predator. During the lunch recess, Robinson reviewed her cross-examination strategy with Detective Taylor and her assistant prosecutor. "She's good," Robinson admitted. She's taking our evidence and reinterpreting it through a lens that removes Richard's culpability. We need to attack the specifics, show that her general principles don't account for Richard's particular behaviors. Taylor nodded, pulling up the list of evidence points they had prepared specifically to counter Morrison's expected testimony. At 1:30 p.m., Robinson began her cross-examination, and the courtroom's energy shifted as prosecutor and expert engaged in intellectual combat. Dr. Morrison, you testified that Richard's prefrontal cortex was approximately 60% developed compared to an adult. Is that correct? Morrison nodded, confident in her earlier testimony. Yes, that's consistent with neurological research on 14-year-old brain development. Robinson picked up a document from her table, Richard's school records. Then how do you explain that Richard was enrolled in advanced placement courses at his high school, courses designed for students capable of college-level abstract reasoning? Morrison's expression didn't change, but Robinson saw the slight hesitation before she responded. Academic achievement and emotional regulation are controlled by different neural systems. Richard could excel in structured academic environments while still lacking the emotional and impulse control necessary to resist manipulation in social contexts. Robinson nodded, accepting the answer, but immediately following with her next question. You testified that adolescents have impaired capacity to evaluate long-term consequences. Yet Richard researched Roper v. Simmons, the Supreme Court case that abolished death penalty for juveniles. He understood that committing these murders at age 14 meant he could never face execution. Does that demonstrate consequence evaluation? Morrison shifted slightly in her seat. That research was part of Cypher's instruction protocol, as I testified earlier. Richard was following directions, not engaging in authentic consequence assessment. Robinson pulled up the search history timeline that Dr. Chen had recovered. Dr. Morrison, Richard's search history shows he researched juvenile sentencing laws on November 9th, second to full days before Cypher sent him the technical manual with detailed instructions. How was he following Cypher's directions before Cypher gave those directions? The courtroom went silent as Morrison processed this timeline discrepancy. I would need to review the specific timestamps, Morrison said, her confidence wavering slightly. Robinson displayed the evidence on screen, showing Richard's independent research predating Cypher's explicit instructions. This shows autonomous research into consequences, does it not? Richard independently sought information about what would happen to him legally if he murdered his family before Cypher told him to do that research. Doesn't that contradict your theory that he was simply executing Cypher's script? Morrison recovered her composure, but Robinson had scored a significant point. It demonstrates that Richard was already in an anxious state about consequences, which is actually consistent with someone under psychological duress from manipulation. The answer was defensive, and Robinson pressed her advantage. Or it demonstrates calculated planning by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and wanted to confirm the maximum punishment he would face. Isn't that equally consistent with the evidence? Hoffman objected to the argumentative nature of the question, and Judge Chen sustained the objection, but the jury had heard Robinson's point. Robinson shifted to another aspect of Morrison's testimony. You described Richard as being in a dissociative state when he committed these murders. Can you define dissociative state for the jury? Morrison explained the psychological concept, describing it as a mental state where an individual becomes detached from reality and acts without full conscious awareness. So, a dissociative state would have impaired memory of their actions, correct? Robinson asked. Morrison agreed this was typical. Yet Richard gave police a detailed account of his supposed alibi, including specific times he claimed to arrive at his friend's house, what game they supposedly planned to play, why his parents changed their minds. Does that level of detailed narrative construction indicate impaired consciousness? Morrison explained that dissociative states could be compartmentalized, that Richard could have been fully conscious when creating his alibi, but dissociated during the actual murders. Robinson pulled up the GPS timeline showing Richard's phone moving from room to room during the critical minutes. Dr. Morrison, the GPS data shows Richard spent 4 minutes in Serafina's room, 6 minutes in the master bedroom, and 11 minutes in his father's office. If he were in a dissociative state, would he be capable of the time management and sequential execution these intervals suggest? Morrison acknowledged that the timing did suggest conscious planning, but maintained that someone could execute a pre-planned sequence while dissociated from the moral implications. "Let me ask you about a specific piece of evidence," Robinson said, pulling up Serafina's incomplete email. Richard's sister was typing a message to her father, "Daddy Richard is here," and he has, when the laptop was shut down. The evidence shows Richard entered her room, saw her trying to send this message, powered down the computer, and then murdered her. Does that sequence indicate someone dissociated from reality or someone consciously eliminating a witness? Morrison's answer was careful, acknowledging that the sequence suggested awareness while maintaining that awareness of immediate actions didn't preclude dissociation from moral consequences. Robinson challenged this distinction, asking whether Morrison was simply defining dissociation so broadly that any action could be explained by it, regardless of how calculated it appeared. The cross-examination continued for 2 hours, with Robinson systematically undermining Morrison's central thesis by presenting evidence of Richard's calculated choices, his witness elimination, his research into consequences, and his creation of alibis. Each piece of evidence demonstrated conscious planning that contradicted the passive victimization Morrison had described. Hoffman's redirect examination attempted to repair the damage, having Morrison explain how sophisticated manipulation could create elaborate planning behaviors, even in someone lacking authentic agency. But Robinson's cross had planted seeds of doubt, showing the jury that Morrison's theoretical framework struggled to account for Richard's specific actions. The defense called additional witnesses over the next 2 days. Richard's former teachers who described him as a model student, family friends who testified to the normalcy of the Ashford household before the murders, and a second psychologist who supported Morrison's adolescent brain development arguments. But Robinson's cross-examination of each witness revealed gaps in their knowledge. None had known about Reginald's journal documenting Richard's sociopathic behaviors. None had been aware of his dark web activity. None could explain the calculated nature of his crimes. The defense rested on January 20th, and Robinson prepared for her rebuttal case. She would call her own neuropsychology expert to counter Morrison's testimony, emphasizing that impaired prefrontal cortex development didn't eliminate capacity for premeditation or understanding of wrongfulness. She would present Reginald's journal as evidence that Richard's pathology predated Cypher's involvement. And she would recall Dr. Chen to walk the jury through Richard's pattern of calculated deception, showing that his actions demonstrated consciousness and choice at every step. As the trial moved into its final phase, the battle of expert testimony had clarified the central question for the jury. Was Richard Ashford a victim of manipulation whose immature brain had been exploited? Or was he a calculating killer who had used Cypher's ideology to justify murders he had researched and planned with adult-level sophistication? The defense had presented a sympathetic scientific framework, but Robinson's methodical cross-examination had exposed the weaknesses in applying that framework to Richard's specific behaviors. The verdict would hinge on whether the jury believed brain development excused calculated choices or whether Richard's actions demonstrated culpability that transcended his age. On January 24, 2022, at 9:47 a.m., Defense attorney Gerald Hoffman called Richard Ashford to the witness stand, and the courtroom atmosphere transformed with electric tension. For 14 days, the jury had heard about Richard through evidence, expert testimony, and witness accounts, but they had never heard directly from him. Now, the 14-year-old boy at the center of this tragedy would speak for himself, and every person in courtroom 4A understood that this testimony could determine the verdict. Richard stood from the defense table with practiced composure, walked to the witness stand with steady steps, and raised his right hand to be sworn in with an expression that was carefully neutral but not quite emotionless. Hoffman began with softball questions designed to humanize his client: Richard's age, his school, his hobbies before the murders. Richard answered each question in a clear voice, maintaining eye contact with Hoffman and occasionally glancing at the jury with what appeared to be respectful attentiveness. "Richard, can you tell the jury about your relationship with your family before November 11th?" Hoffman asked, and Richard's expression softened into something that resembled grief. "I loved my family," Richard said, his voice steady but quieter than before. "My dad was strict sometimes, but I knew he just wanted me to succeed. My mom was always supportive, always there when I needed to talk. And Serafina, she was my little sister. She could be annoying like little sisters are, but I loved her." The words were appropriate, hitting the expected emotional beats, but Prosecutor Robinson watched Richard's facial expressions and saw the performance beneath them. Hoffman guided Richard through the events leading to November 11th, eliciting testimony about the credit card theft that had triggered his grounding. "I made a stupid decision," Richard said, and Robinson noted the careful phrasing. "I wanted these items in fortnight, and I didn't think my dad would notice one purchase. I was wrong, and I knew I deserved to be punished when he found out." "What happened after you were grounded?" Hoffman asked, leading Richard toward the critical testimony about Cypher's influence. Richard's expression shifted, becoming more troubled, more vulnerable. "I was angry at first," Richard admitted. "Not at my parents, really, just frustrated at the situation. I went on this forum where people talked about feeling controlled by parents, and at first it just felt good to vent, to have people who understood." He paused, as if gathering himself. "That's when Cypher started messaging me." Hoffman introduced the forum communications into evidence and asked Richard to explain his mindset as he read Cypher's messages. "At first, Cypher just seemed like someone who understood what I was going through," Richard testified. "He said things that made sense to me at the time, about how parents use control to maintain power, about how I deserved autonomy. I didn't realize he was manipulating me." Robinson made notes as Richard's testimony followed the defense script Morrison had previewed. Vulnerable teenager, validation-seeking, gradually indoctrinated by sophisticated manipulation. But she was watching for the moments where Richard's performance slipped, where the calculated nature of his actions would emerge through his own words. "Richard, when Cypher started discussing violence against your parents, how did you respond?" Hoffman asked, his tone gentle and non-judgmental. Richard's hands tightened on the arms of the witness chair, a micro-expression of tension. "I thought he was just talking theoretically at first," Richard said, "like dark humor or philosophical discussion. I didn't think he meant I should actually do anything, but he kept pushing, kept saying it was my only path to freedom, and I started to believe him. I was spending hours every day on the forum, and Cypher's messages became like a voice in my head, telling me what to think." Hoffman asked about the moment Richard decided to act on Cypher's instructions, and Richard's testimony became more emotional, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I decided or if Cypher decided for me. By November 11th, I felt like I wasn't even controlling my own thoughts anymore. Everything Cypher said made sense, and everything my parents said felt like oppression. I was in this mental state where I believed killing them would solve everything." Robinson planned her cross-examination as she listened, identifying the key inconsistencies between Richard's testimony and the documentary evidence. He was portraying himself as passively absorbed into Cypher's ideology, but his search history showed active research. He was claiming he felt controlled by Cypher's voice, but his text messages showed calculated alibi creation before Cypher's final instructions arrived. Hoffman asked the question the jury was waiting for. "Richard, can you tell us what happened on the night of November 11?" Richard took a breath, his composure visibly straining, and began his account of the murders. "I remember getting the gun from the garage," Richard said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, like it wasn't really me doing it. I went to Serafina's room first because Cypher said the youngest first. I remember opening her door, remember her looking up at me. And then it's like there's this gap in my memory. I remember the sound of the gun, and then I was in my parents' bedroom." The description was clinically detached, and Robinson saw several jurors shifting uncomfortably. Richard was describing dissociation, but the flatness of his recounting felt wrong, performative, rather than genuinely traumatized. He continued through the sequence of murders with the same detached narration, claiming memory gaps and emotional numbness that contradicted the GPS data showing deliberate, time-managed movement through the house. "After it was over," Richard testified, "I went back to my room and I just sat there. I couldn't process what I'd done. It felt like a nightmare, like it hadn't really happened. When I called 911 in the morning, I think I was still in shock." Hoffman concluded his direct examination by asking Richard about his current state of mind. "I'm devastated," Richard said, and for the first time, tears appeared in his eyes. "I wish I could take it back. I wish I'd never gone on that forum, never listened to Cypher. I miss my family every day. I know nothing I say can bring them back. But I need people to understand that I wasn't myself when this happened. Cypher turned me into someone I'm not." The tears seemed genuine, the remorse appeared authentic, and Robinson saw that Hoffman had coached Richard well. The testimony was designed to trigger the jury's sympathy, to make them see a tragic victim rather than a calculating killer. But Robinson had 2 hours of cross-examination planned, and she intended to expose every inconsistency between Richard's performance and the evidence. After a brief recess, Robinson approached the witness stand, her demeanor professional but not hostile. "Richard, you testified that you loved your family, is that correct?" Richard nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Robinson pulled up a screenshot of one of Richard's forum posts from November 10th. "Can you read this post you made to the Liberation Front, please?" Richard's expression tightened slightly as he read his own words. "Can't wait until these parasites are out of my life. Every day in this house is psychological torture. They pretend to love me while controlling every aspect of my existence." "Does that sound like someone who loved his family?" Robinson asked. Richard's carefully constructed composure showed its first real crack. "I was angry when I wrote that. Cypher had me convinced that my parents were my enemies." Robinson nodded, accepting the answer but immediately following with another post. "This one is from November 8th, 3 days before Cypher sent you detailed murder instructions. You wrote, 'What's the point of living if you're not free? Sometimes I think about how simple it would be to just end the source of my oppression.' Did Cypher force you to have those thoughts?" Richard's jaw tightened. "He influenced them. He created the mental framework where I started having thoughts like that." Robinson pulled up Richard's search history. On November 9th, you researched juvenile sentencing laws, specifically Roper v. Simmons. Why were you researching the death penalty for juveniles if you weren't already contemplating murder? Richard's answer came slowly. "I was curious about the legal system after reading discussions on the forum." Robinson displayed the timestamp prominently. This search occurred at 2:17 p.m. on November 9th, a full 33 hours before Cypher sent you the technical manual with murder instructions. You were researching the consequences of murdering your family before Cypher told you to murder your family. Doesn't that indicate you were already planning this independently? Hoffman objected, but Judge Chen allowed the question. I don't remember exactly when I started planning, Richard said, his composure fraying. Everything from those days is confused in my memory. Robinson pressed harder. Let's talk about your memory. You testified that you have gaps in your memory from the night of the murders, that you felt like you were watching yourself from outside your body, correct? Richard nodded. Yet you remember very specific details from other parts of that night. You remember getting the gun from the garage. You remember which room you went to first. You remember calling 911 at 6:47 a.m. Your memory seems quite selective, doesn't it? Trauma affects memory differently, Richard said, repeating what Morrison had testified. Robinson pulled up the GPS data. The GPS data shows you spent 4 minutes in Serafina's room, then moved to the master bedroom. But you testified you have a memory gap after shooting your sister. How did you know to move to the next location if you were in a dissociative fugue state? Richard struggled to answer, his carefully rehearsed testimony colliding with the mathematical precision of the GPS logs. I must have been following Cypher's instructions without conscious thought, he said finally. Robinson picked up the technical manual Cypher had sent. Cypher's instructions specified the order: youngest, mother, father. You followed that sequence exactly, moving from room to room with timing that suggests you were managing your schedule to complete all 3 murders efficiently. Does that sound like someone in a dissociative state or someone executing a plan? Richard's composure crumbled further as he grasped for answers that would reconcile his testimony with the evidence. Robinson shifted to the most damning evidence, Serafina's attempt to warn their parents. Richard, your sister sent a text message to your father at 6:15 p.m. on November 11th using your mother's phone. She wrote, Richard said what I saw was a game, but it wasn't. It was a plan to hurt us. Do you remember seeing that message? Richard's face went pale. I didn't see that message. Robinson displayed the evidence timeline. At 6:20 p.m., the home network shows someone accessing your father's email account from your laptop, reading the messages Serafina had sent. That was you, wasn't it? Richard's hands gripped the witness chair arms with visible tension. I might have checked my dad's email. I don't remember why. Robinson pressed the point relentlessly. You checked his email because you knew Serafina was trying to warn him. You saw her messages. You knew your window to act was closing because your father was planning to confront you that night. So you moved up your timeline and killed Serafina first before your father could get home and stop you. Isn't that what really happened? Richard's composure shattered completely. No, I didn't. I wasn't thinking that clearly. I was confused. Robinson pulled up the incomplete email Serafina had been typing when Richard entered her room. Your sister's last words were, Daddy Richard is here and he has. She was trying to warn your father that you had a gun. You saw her typing this message, you shut down her laptop, and you shot her. That's not confusion, Richard. That's calculated witness elimination. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Richard struggled to respond, tears streaming down his face, but his answers becoming increasingly incoherent. Robinson spent another hour systematically dismantling Richard's testimony, contrasting his claims of memory gaps with his detailed police statement, his claims of dissociation with his precise execution of Cypher's instructions, his claims of remorse with his forum posts celebrating his upcoming liberation. By the time Robinson concluded her cross-examination, Richard's carefully constructed defense had been exposed as performance, his testimony revealing the calculated mind beneath the grief-stricken facade. Hoffman's redirect examination attempted damage control, having Richard explain that his contradictions were due to trauma and confusion, but the jury had seen behind the mask. Richard's testimony intended to humanize him, had instead demonstrated his capacity for manipulation and deception. As he left the witness stand at 4:30 p.m., his composure was gone, his face blotchy from tears, his hands shaking. But Robinson had watched his eyes throughout the cross-examination, and she had seen not traumatized grief, but controlled fury at being caught in his lies. The defense rested, and the trial moved toward closing arguments. Richard's testimony had been the defense's final gambit, their last opportunity to sway the jury toward sympathy rather than conviction. But Robinson's methodical cross-examination had transformed Richard's performance into the prosecution's strongest evidence of his calculated nature, his capacity for deception, and his culpability for 3 murders he had tried to absolve himself of through claims of manipulation and dissociation. The Chatham County Courthouse felt different on January 26, 2022, as if the building itself understood that the trial was reaching its culmination. Prosecutor Sophia Robinson arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours before closing arguments were scheduled to begin, and sat alone in her office reviewing 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, and strategic decisions. She had built her case methodically, the GPS data establishing presence, the forum communications establishing motive, Reginald's journal establishing pathology, Serafina's digital trail establishing premeditation, and Richard's own testimony establishing deception. Now she needed to weave these threads into a narrative that would compel 12 jurors to convict a 14-year-old boy of first-degree murder. Judge Chen called court to order at 9 a.m., and Robinson stood to deliver the prosecution's closing argument. She had prepared extensively, crafting her words to balance legal precision with emotional resonance, to acknowledge the tragedy while insisting on accountability. Members of the jury, she began, 3 weeks ago in my opening statement, I told you that Richard Ashford murdered his entire family with calculated precision. I told you the evidence would prove premeditation, consciousness of guilt, and cold calculation. Now, after hearing that evidence, I ask you to deliberate on a simple question. Does the evidence show that Richard Ashford is guilty of 3 counts of malice murder in the first degree? She walked to the evidence table, where the GPS data board remained displayed prominently. Let's start with the most irrefutable evidence, Richard's location during the murders. The defense wants you to believe Richard was at a friend's house when his family was killed. The GPS data from the deleted tracking app proves that's a lie. Richard's phone was in Serafina's room at 11:43 p.m., in the master bedroom at 11:52 p.m., and in Reginald's office at 12:03 a.m. These aren't approximate locations. These are precise coordinates that place Richard within feet of each victim at the exact moment they were murdered. Robinson pulled up the timeline showing Richard's movements synchronized with the medical examiner's time of death estimates. Richard himself testified that he was using his phone constantly during this period, logged into the Liberation Front forum, posting updates to Cypher. Someone was actively using that phone during the murders, and that someone was Richard Ashford. The defense offered no explanation for how Richard's phone could be at the murder scenes while Richard was supposedly elsewhere. Because there is no explanation except the truth. Richard was there. Richard committed these murders. She moved to the forum communications, displaying key exchanges between Richard and Cypher. The defense argued that Richard was manipulated by Cypher, that he was a vulnerable teenager exploited by an adult predator. And I don't dispute that Cypher is a predator who should be prosecuted for his role in this tragedy, but Cypher's manipulation doesn't eliminate Richard's choices. And the evidence shows Richard making conscious, calculated choices at every step. Robinson highlighted Richard's search history, showing independent research into juvenile sentencing laws before Cypher provided detailed instructions. Richard researched Roper v. Simmons on November 9th, learning that juveniles cannot face the death penalty for murder. This wasn't following Cypher's directions. This was Richard independently calculating the consequences of murdering his family and determining that life without parole was an acceptable price for financial freedom. That's not manipulation. That's cold calculation. She displayed Richard's forum posts from the days before the murders, posts expressing anticipation rather than reluctance. The defense wants you to believe Richard was in a dissociative state, acting without conscious will. But read his own words. Can't wait until these parasites are out of my life. What's the point of living if you're not free? These aren't the words of someone being forced against their will. These are the words of someone who had decided his family needed to die. Robinson turned to address the jury directly, her voice carrying controlled passion. But the most damning evidence of premeditation isn't the GPS data or the forum posts. It's what Richard did to his 8-year-old sister. Serafina discovered Richard's liberation plan document on his computer. She sent text messages to her father warning him. She attempted to email him. She did everything a brave, intelligent third grader could do to save her family. She pulled up Serafina's incomplete final message, and several jurors visibly reacted to seeing it again. Richard knew Serafina was trying to warn their parents. He intercepted her messages, deleted her emails, and texted his father a false explanation. Then, when those efforts weren't enough, when Serafina persisted in trying to alert Reginald, Richard murdered her first. Not as a witness to other murders, but as the primary threat to his plan. He shot an 8-year-old girl who was typing a warning to her father. "Daddy, Richard is here, and he has." Robinson's voice broke slightly, genuine emotion bleeding through her professional composure. That's not dissociation. That's not manipulation. That's calculated witness elimination by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Richard murdered Serafina specifically to silence her warnings, and he did it with enough presence of mind to power down her laptop so she couldn't finish her message. She moved through the remaining evidence systematically. Reginald's journal documenting Richard's sociopathic tendencies predating Cypher's involvement. The deliberate deletion of the GPS tracking app demonstrating consciousness of guilt. Richard's performance for Dr. Morrison contrasted with his true behavioral history. The defense presented expert testimony about adolescent brain development, and I don't dispute the science. Teenage brains are still developing. But impaired brain development doesn't eliminate criminal responsibility, and it certainly doesn't explain the level of sophistication Richard demonstrated. Robinson addressed the defense's central argument directly. Dr. Morrison testified that Richard was in a dissociative state, that he was executing Cypher's script without authentic agency, but the evidence contradicts that theory at every turn. Richard created his alibi before Cypher's final instructions arrived. Richard researched consequences independently. Richard monitored his sister's warnings and adapted his plan to address that threat. Richard deleted the GPS app after the murders to hide his location data. These aren't the actions of someone dissociated from reality. These are the actions of someone acutely aware of reality and desperately trying to avoid consequences. She walked back to the prosecution table and picked up her final exhibit, a photograph of the Ashford family taken 6 months before the murders, showing Reginald, Cordelia, Serafina, and Richard smiling on a beach in Tybee Island. This was the family Richard destroyed, a father who loved him enough to document his concerning behaviors while trying to find help, a mother who devoted her life to healing children, a sister who tried to save them all, 3 people who deserved to live, who deserved justice. Robinson's closing built to its final argument. The defense asks you to feel sympathy for Richard, to see him as a victim of manipulation. I ask you to feel sympathy for Reginald, who tried to intervene but was killed before he could act. Feel sympathy for Cordelia, who believed in redemption and paid for that belief with her life. Feel sympathy for Serafina, who showed more courage at 8 years old than her teenage brother showed in his entire life. Those are the victims in this case, not Richard Ashford, She returned to stand directly in front of the jury box. Your job is to determine whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Ashford committed 3 counts of malice murder in the first degree. The evidence proves he was present at each murder scene. The evidence proves he planned these murders over multiple days. The evidence proves he understood the consequences of his actions. The evidence proves he eliminated his sister as a witness. And the evidence proves he attempted to cover up his crimes through alibi creation and digital deletion. That's not manipulation, that's malice murder, and I ask you to return guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Robinson concluded at 10:32 a.m., and after a brief recess, Gerald Hoffman stood to deliver the defense's closing argument. His approach was fundamentally different, eschewing a detailed evidence review in favor of an emotional appeal to the jury's capacity for mercy. Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I want to acknowledge something that the prosecution said. Reginald, Cordelia, and Serafina Ashford were victims. They deserved to live. Their deaths are tragic and senseless. But punishing a 14-year-old child who was manipulated by a predator won't bring them back, and it won't serve justice. Hoffman walked to stand beside Richard, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed. Look at him. He's 14 years old. His brain won't be fully developed for another 11 years. He made terrible choices under the influence of an adult predator who specifically targeted him for manipulation. Yes, Richard pulled the trigger. Yes, Richard committed these acts. But the question before you isn't whether these deaths occurred. It's whether Richard possessed the culpability required for first-degree murder. He addressed Robinson's evidence systematically, reframing each point through the lens of adolescent vulnerability. The prosecution showed you Richard's research into sentencing laws and argued it proves calculated planning. But Dr. Morrison explained that this research was part of Richard's anxious response to manipulation, not authentic consequence evaluation. A 14-year-old researching legal consequences doesn't demonstrate the same culpability as an adult making that same research. Hoffman displayed the forum communications, emphasizing Cypher's role. The prosecution wants you to focus on Richard's choices, but look at who was guiding those choices. Cypher spent 72 hours systematically breaking down Richard's resistance, providing ideological frameworks, offering step-by-step instructions. This wasn't a teenager independently deciding to commit murder. This was a sophisticated predator creating a killer out of a vulnerable child. He addressed Serafina's death with particular care, knowing it was the prosecution's strongest emotional evidence. Serafina's death is heartbreaking, and the prosecution is right that Richard killed her to prevent her warnings from reaching their father. But consider what that tells us about Richard's mental state. He wasn't thinking rationally about consequences. He was in panic mode, desperately trying to maintain Cypher's approval and complete the liberation Cypher had convinced him was his only option. That's not calculated planning. That's a child in psychological crisis acting on distorted beliefs instilled by an adult manipulator. Hoffman's closing emphasized the systemic failures that enabled the tragedy. This case isn't just about Richard's choices. It's about a society that allowed a predator like Cypher to operate freely, grooming teenagers across the country with impunity. It's about parents who documented concerning behaviors but couldn't access effective intervention. It's about a mental health system that dismissed warning signs. Richard made choices, terrible choices, but those choices occurred in a context of failures by every adult system that should have protected him. He concluded with an appeal to the jury's capacity for nuance. I'm not asking you to excuse what Richard did. I'm asking you to consider his age, his vulnerability, and the manipulation he endured when determining his culpability. First-degree murder requires malice aforethought, the kind of cold, calculated intent that only a fully formed mind can possess. Richard's mind wasn't fully formed. It was manipulated, distorted, and exploited. I ask you to return verdicts that acknowledge Richard's actions while recognizing his diminished culpability, guilty of lesser charges that account for his age and the manipulation he endured. The closing arguments concluded at 12:15 p.m., and after lunch, Judge Chen delivered jury instructions explaining the elements of first-degree murder, the burden of proof, and the verdict options available. At 2:30 p.m., the jury retired to deliberate, and the waiting began. Robinson sat in her office, confident in her evidence but uncertain about the jury's verdict. Hoffman had made an effective emotional appeal, and the question of how much weight the jury would give to Richard's age and Cypher's manipulation remained open. For 3 days, the jury deliberated, sending out questions about the legal definition of premeditation, requesting to review the GPS data and forum communications, and indicating through their careful process that they were taking their responsibility seriously. Robinson waited with Detective Taylor, reviewing the trial transcript and preparing for both victory and potential appeal scenarios. The uncertainty was agonizing, but she trusted that the evidence methodically presented over 3 weeks would ultimately prevail. The jury returned its verdict at 11:23 a.m. on January 29, 2022, after 27 hours of deliberation spread across 3 days. The courtroom filled within minutes of the announcement, media representatives occupying every available seat, Cordelia's extended family gathering on one side of the gallery, Richard's aunt sitting alone on the other. Prosecutor Sophia Robinson took her position at the counsel table with the calm certainty of someone who had presented overwhelming evidence, while defense attorney Gerald Hoffman's expression carried the weariness of someone who knew his emotional appeals might not overcome the mathematical precision of GPS data and digital forensics. Richard sat between his attorneys, his face pale and his hands folded on the table, his carefully constructed composure from earlier in the trial replaced by visible anxiety. Judge Margaret Chen called the court to order, and the jury filed in with expressions that revealed nothing. The foreperson, a 52-year-old high school principal who had been selected by her fellow jurors for her analytical mind and calm demeanor, held the verdict forms. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Chen asked, and the foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff retrieved the verdict forms and delivered them to Judge Chen, who reviewed them silently before returning them to the foreperson. The courtroom held its collective breath. On the charge of malice murder in the first degree concerning the death of Serafina Ashford, how do you find the defendant? The foreperson's voice was steady and clear. "We find the defendant Richard Ashford guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Richard's composure cracked visibly, his face contorting with what might have been shock or carefully performed disbelief. Cordelia's sister began crying softly, and Hoffman placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. On the charge of malice murder in the first degree concerning the death of Cordelia Ashford, how do you find the defendant? Judge Chen continued without pause. "We find the defendant, Richard Ashford, guilty." Richard's head dropped forward, his shoulders shaking, and Robinson felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The jury had seen through the defense's manipulation narrative and had held Richard accountable. On the charge of malice murder in the first degree concerning the death of Reginald Ashford, how do you find the defendant? "We find the defendant, Richard Ashford, guilty." 3 guilty verdicts, unanimous jury decisions on all counts. Judge Chen thanked the jury for their service and set the sentencing hearing for February 15th, giving both sides 2 weeks to prepare their sentencing arguments. The media coverage of the verdict was immediate and intense, with legal commentators debating the implications of convicting a 14-year-old of first-degree murder in the era of increased awareness about adolescent brain development. National headlines focused on the sensational aspects: teen killer convicted of murdering family, dark web radicalization leads to triple murder conviction, GPS data seals fate of 14-year-old murderer. But beneath the sensationalism, serious legal scholars recognize the case as a landmark in how courts would handle juvenile defendants with sophisticated technological evidence proving premeditation. Robinson spent the intervening 2 weeks preparing her sentencing argument, consulting with the victims' family members about what they wanted to say to Richard, and researching Georgia's sentencing framework for juvenile murderers. Under Roper v. Simmons and subsequent Supreme Court decisions, Richard could not be sentenced to death, and Miller v. Alabama required that juvenile offenders be given consideration for eventual parole review. But Georgia law allowed for life without parole for juvenile multiple murderers, and Robinson intended to argue for exactly that sentence. The sentencing hearing began on February 15th at 9 a.m., and Judge Chen's courtroom was once again packed with observers. Hoffman presented mitigation evidence first. Richard's clean record before the murders, letters from teachers describing him as a model student, Dr. Morrison's testimony about his ongoing psychological vulnerability, and Richard's own statement expressing remorse. "I know nothing I say can bring back my family," Richard read from a prepared statement, his voice breaking appropriately. "I think about them every day. I wish I could take back what I did. I was manipulated and confused, but I know I made the final choices. I'm asking for a chance at redemption someday." The statement was well crafted and delivered with apparent sincerity, but Robinson had watched Richard throughout the trial and no longer believed his performances. She stood for her sentencing argument and called her first witness, Cordelia's sister, Dr. Patricia Martinez, who delivered a victim impact statement that left half the courtroom in tears. "My sister devoted her life to healing children," Martinez said, her voice thick with grief. "She saw the best in everyone, including her son. When Reginald tried to warn her about Richard's concerning behaviors, she believed love and patience would fix whatever was wrong. That faith killed her. Richard shot her while she slept, took advantage of her trust and her compassion. And now my niece, her daughter, is gone too. Serafina was 8 years old, brilliant and brave. She tried to save her parents, and Richard murdered her for it." Martinez turned to address Richard directly, and he looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. "You took my sister, my brother-in-law, and my niece from this world. You orphaned yourself for video game currency and the approval of an internet stranger. There's no sentence long enough to match what you've taken, but I'm asking the court to ensure you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. Life without parole is the only appropriate sentence." Robinson followed with her own sentencing argument, systematically presenting the aggravating factors: multiple victims, including a child, witness elimination, extensive premeditation, and Richard's documented lack of remorse. The defense argues that Richard deserves consideration for eventual parole based on his age, but this case presents extreme circumstances that justify life without parole even for a 14-year-old defendant. She displayed the GPS data one final time, the physical evidence that had anchored the entire case. Richard didn't commit a single impulsive act. He committed 3 separate calculated murders over a 37-minute period. Between each murder, he had time to stop, to reconsider, to choose differently. He chose to continue. That demonstrates a level of depravity that transcends age. Robinson pulled up Serafina's incomplete email for the final time, and the impact on Judge Chen's expression was visible. This little girl tried everything to save her family. She warned her father. She sent messages. She kept trying even when Richard intercepted her communications. And when Richard walked into her room, she was still trying, typing a final warning to her father. Richard saw what she was doing and killed her anyway. That's not a child making a mistake. That's a calculating killer eliminating a threat. She concluded with a direct appeal to Judge Chen. The law gives you discretion in sentencing juvenile offenders, and that discretion should account for the unique circumstances of each case. In Richard Ashford's case, the evidence shows someone who planned meticulously, who researched consequences, who eliminated witnesses, and who has shown no genuine remorse. The prosecution recommends a sentence of life without parole on all 3 counts to be served consecutively, ensuring Richard Ashford never again poses a threat to society. Hoffman's sentencing argument emphasized Richard's age and the possibility of rehabilitation, arguing that sentencing a 14-year-old to life without parole was constitutionally suspect and morally unjustifiable. Richard will be in prison for the rest of his life regardless of your Honor's specific sentence. The question is whether, in 25 or 30 years, when Richard is a middle-aged man whose brain has fully developed, he should have a chance to demonstrate rehabilitation and petition for release. I believe he should have that chance. Judge Chen took a 30-minute recess to consider the arguments, and when she returned, her expression was grave. This is one of the most difficult sentencing decisions I've faced in 20 years on the bench. The crimes Richard Ashford committed are horrific, calculated, and unforgivable. 3 innocent people are dead, including an 8-year-old child who died trying to protect her family. The evidence of premeditation is overwhelming, and the defendant's lack of genuine remorse is concerning. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. However, I must also consider that Richard Ashford was 14 years old at the time of these crimes. The Supreme Court has made clear that children are different, that their capacity for change and rehabilitation must be considered even in the most serious cases. I've reviewed the Miller factors, including Richard's age, his family environment, the circumstances of the offense, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Judge Chen delivered her sentence with judicial precision. On the charge of malice murder in the first degree for the death of Serafina Ashford, I sentence Richard Ashford to life in prison. On charge of malice murder in the first degree for the death of Cordelia Ashford, I sentence Richard Ashford to life in prison. On the charge of malice murder in the first degree for the death of Reginald Ashford, I sentence Richard Ashford to life in prison. These sentences are to be served consecutively. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Chen gavelled for order. Additionally, I am imposing a mandatory minimum of 40 years before Richard Ashford becomes eligible for parole consideration. This means he will not be eligible to petition for release until he is 54 years old, and even then, parole is not guaranteed. The nature of these crimes and the extensive premeditation demonstrated warrant this lengthy minimum. Though Judge Chen had not imposed life without parole, the 40-year mandatory minimum before even parole eligibility essentially guaranteed Richard would spend the majority of his natural life in prison. The media immediately seized on the sentence, with headlines proclaiming 14-year-old sentenced to life plus 40 years, and teen killer gets effective death in custody sentence. The death in custody characterization was legally inaccurate but emotionally resonant, capturing the reality that Richard would spend decades in prison before having any chance at release, and that chance was uncertain at best. Robinson had argued for life without parole, but she recognized that Judge Chen's sentence achieved a similar practical result while technically complying with Miller's requirement for parole consideration. Richard's reaction to the sentence was muted, his face expressionless as he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. The performance of grief and remorse he had maintained during his testimony had vanished, replaced by the cold detachment Robinson had first observed when he sat in his kitchen with his family's bodies in the next rooms. Whatever Richard truly felt about his crimes, about his sentence, about his future, remained locked behind a mask that had slipped during cross-examination but had now returned. As Robinson packed her files and prepared to leave the courthouse, Detective Taylor approached with a final piece of information. FBI just informed me that they've identified 3 more teenagers in active communication with Cypher, all at various stages of radicalization. They're intervening before anyone else acts on Cypher's instructions. Robinson felt a cold satisfaction at this news. So Richard's case might prevent future tragedies. Taylor nodded. The publicity has made parents more aware of what their kids are accessing online, and law enforcement has increased resources for tracking dark web radicalization. It's not enough. Cypher is still out there. But it's something. Robinson gathered her briefcase and walked out of the Chatham County Courthouse for the last time on this case, knowing that justice had been served as fully as the law allowed. The Ashford case would enter the legal textbooks as a precedent for handling juvenile murderers with sophisticated digital evidence of premeditation. Richard's sentence would be cited in future cases debating appropriate punishment for teenage killers. And somewhere in the digital darkness, Cypher continued grooming vulnerable adolescents, transforming anger into ideology and ideology into violence, a phantom predator who had destroyed one family completely and threatened countless others. But in Courtroom 4A on February 15, 2022, 3 guilty verdicts and a sentence of life plus 40 years represented the legal system's answer to a 14-year-old boy who had murdered his family with GPS-documented precision. Richard Ashford would spend the next 40 years minimum in Georgia's correctional system, and whether he emerged at 54 as a rehabilitated individual or remained the calculating killer the evidence had revealed would be a question for a future parole board to answer. For now, the case was closed. The victims had received what justice the law could provide, and a community in Savannah, Georgia, could begin the long process of healing from a tragedy that should never have occurred.